Homestead, a wild western adventure. Chapter 1. The thing about staying alive in St. Augustine's home for wayward children was knowing when to keep your mouth shut and when to open your eyes. Eli Ashford had figured that out by age 10, 3 years back, watching Tommy Kellerman get dragged off to the cellar for asking too many questions about the gruel. Tommy came back different, quiet different, not the good kind. Now 13, and lean as a whip from too many missed meals, Eli lay on his straw tick mattress in the dormitory's corner cot, the one nobody wanted because it caught the worst of the winter drafts. But drafts meant you could hear things. Like Matron Grimsby's heels clicking down the corridor at midnight, or the way the floorboards creaked different when she was carrying something heavy. Tonight, she was carrying something heavy. The gaslight in the hall threw her shadow long and crooked against the wall, and Eli counted her steps the way he'd learned to count everything that mattered in this place. 15 steps to the office door. A pause. The rattle of keys. Then nothing but the sound of 42 boys breathing in the dark, some of them whimpering in their sleep like kicked dogs. Eli waited. Patience was another thing that kept you breathing. When Grimsby's office door finally clicked shut, he slipped from his cot. The boy next to him, a pale kid named Fisher who'd arrived last month with burns on his hands, didn't stir. Good. Fisher was the twitchy type, likely to squeal if he woke up scared. The dormitory floor was a map of squeaks and safe spots that Eli had memorized his first week here. Step on a loose board, and you'd find yourself explaining things to Brother Morris and his leather strap. But stick to the wall where the joists were solid, and you could move like smoke. He made it to the door in 12 seconds flat. The hallway reeked of carbolic acid and something else, something sweet and rotten that seemed to seep up from the building's bones. Gas fixtures hissed along the walls, casting everything in that sickly yellow light that made even the healthy kids look like they were dying. Most of them were, one way or another. Eli pressed himself against the wall and crept toward Grimsby's office. The woman had been acting stranger than usual lately, if that was possible. More midnight meetings with men in expensive coats who spoke in whispers. More boys disappearing, supposedly placed with families, but nobody ever got letters or visits from the ones who left. The office door was thick oak, but the keyhole was old-fashioned and wide. Eli dropped to one knee and peered through. Grimsby sat behind her desk, counting money. Not the usual handful of coins the city gave her for each boy's upkeep, but real money, bills thick enough to choke a horse. Across from her sat a man Eli had never seen before, though he'd heard the voice. Smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. 60 head this shipment, the man was saying. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than the orphanage spent on food in a month. The mining concerns out in Colorado are paying premium for young workers. Strong backs, small hands for the tight spaces. Grimsby's laugh sounded like nails on slate. They won't be strong for long, will they, Mr. Kelligan? Kelligan. The name hit Eli like a fist to the gut. He'd heard it whispered in the dormitory, always followed by crossed fingers or prayers. Iron Jack Kelligan, they called him. The kind of man who collected debts in blood when coin came up short. That's not our concern, Kelligan said, lighting a cigarette with a gold lighter. Our concern is delivery. The Orphan Train Society provides excellent cover. Who's going to question a humanitarian effort to find these unfortunates good homes? And if any of them tried to run? Kelligan's smile was all teeth. They won't run far. Eli's hands clenched into fists. He'd always suspected the placement program was wrong somehow, but this was worse than wrong. This was selling kids like cattle. I've selected 40 for the morning train, Grimsby continued, shuffling through a stack of papers. The usual mix, old enough to work, young enough to control. That Ashford boy is 13 now, getting too smart for his own good. He goes. The words hit Eli like a bucket of ice water. His name on that list meant a train west, meant minds and men like Kelligan, who measured children by how much work they could squeeze out before they broke. "Excellent," Kelligan said, standing. "The train leaves at dawn. Make sure they're ready." "What about the ones who know too much? That Kellerman boy has been asking questions since he came back from—" "Mr. Kellerman won't be asking any more questions," Kelligan said quietly. "Some problems solve themselves." Eli's blood turned cold. Tommy Kellerman had been found dead in his cot 2 days ago. "Weak heart," Brother Morris had said. "Natural causes." But Tommy had been strong as an ox before his trip to the cellar. Footsteps moved toward the door. Eli scrambled back down the hall, his mind racing. 40 kids on tomorrow's train, and his name at the top of the list. No time to warn anyone, no time to plan. The choice was simple: run now and probably die in the streets, or get on that train and definitely die in the mines. He was halfway back to the dormitory when Grimsby's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Going somewhere, Mr. Ashford?" Eli froze. She stood at the far end of the hall, backlit by the office gaslight, looking like Death's maiden aunt in her black dress and wire spectacles. "Couldn't sleep, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice level. "Was just walking it off." "How thoughtful." She moved closer, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "And did your walk take you past my office by any chance?" "No, ma'am. Just to the privy and back." Grimsby studied him with eyes like chips of flint. She knew. Maybe not exactly what he'd heard, but she knew something. In a place like this, suspicion was enough to get you killed. "Well then," she said finally, "you'd best get your rest. You have a big day tomorrow." The smile that spread across her face was the worst thing Eli had ever seen. Worse than Brother Morris's strap, worse than the sounds that came from the cellar at night. It was the smile of someone who owned you, body and soul, and knew it. "Pack your things, boy," Grimsby said, turning back toward her office. "You leave on tomorrow's train." Eli stood there in the hallway, watching her disappear into the yellow gaslight, and felt something die inside him. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was just the last piece of childhood he'd been carrying around like a lucky penny. Didn't matter now. Come morning, he'd be cargo on Kelligan's train, heading west to die in some hole in the ground. Unless he figured out a way to change the game. And Eli Ashford had always been good at changing games. He walked back to his cot, moving slow and easy like a boy with nothing but sleep on his mind. But behind his eyes, his thoughts were moving fast as wildfire, and twice as dangerous. The other boys were still breathing their quiet, desperate breaths in the dark. 40 of them marked for tomorrow's train. 40 kids who didn't know they were already dead. But maybe, just maybe, one of them was about to get a whole lot smarter. Eli lay down on his straw tick mattress and stared at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. He had work to do. Chapter 2. Dawn came gray and bitter through the dormitory windows, bringing with it the sound of Brother Morris banging his walking stick against the iron bed frames. "Up, you little heathens. Selection day waits for no one." Eli had been awake for 2 hours, lying still as death while he worked the problem. 40 kids marked for Kelligan's train. No way to warn them all without causing a panic that would get everyone killed. But maybe he didn't need to warn everyone. Maybe he just needed to find the right ones, the ones who might actually survive what was coming. The dormitory exploded into its usual morning chaos. Boys stumbled toward the wash basins, fighting over the brown soap and cold water. The smart ones had learned to get there first. The weak ones waited for scraps, same as always. Eli watched them and sorted them. Fisher, the pale kid with the burned hands, too jumpy, wouldn't last a day on the trail. Matthews, 16 and strong, but dumber than a fence post, muscle without brains, was just meat waiting to be ground up. But there, by the far window, washing his face with quick, efficient movements, was Milo Oates. 12 years old, and built like a scarecrow, but with eyes that missed nothing, and fingers that could lift a wallet from a man's pocket while shaking his hand. Street kid before he got caught, which meant he knew things the orphanage boys had never learned. Things like how to run, how to hide, and how to stay alive when the whole world wanted you dead. Eli made his way over, casual-like, timing it so he arrived at the basin just as Milo finished washing. "Heard we're getting placed today," Eli said, keeping his voice low. Milo's hands stilled on the towel. Kid was quick. He'd already figured out that placement was the wrong word for whatever was happening. "You believe that story about families wanting us?" Milo asked. "About as much as I believe Brother Morris actually prays before he beats us." That got him a sharp look. Milo glanced around, making sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Been watching the adults. They're nervous. Not excited like you'd expect for kids getting good homes. Nervous like they're doing something that might bite them." "Smart kid." Eli decided to take the risk. "Name's Eli Ashford. We need to talk, but not here. During breakfast." Before Milo could respond, Brother Morris's stick cracked against the wall near their heads. "Enough chatter. Downstairs, all of you." The dining hall smelled of burnt porridge and defeat. Eli found a spot at the long wooden table where he could watch the door, and Milo slid in across from him a few seconds later. The morning slop was thinner than usual, probably saving money since half the boys wouldn't be needing meals much longer. "Whatever you're thinking," Milo whispered, "include me out." "You don't even know what I'm thinking." "I know trouble when I smell it, and you reek of it." Eli spooned the gray porridge into his mouth and talked around it. "Train leaves in 2 hours. 40 boys. You think they're really sending us to farms?" "Hell no." Milo's answer came quick and certain. "Farms need workers in spring and summer. This is February. You send kids to farms now, they'll be dead weight until planting season. Nobody wants dead weight. They have to feed for 3 months. So where are we going?" Milo's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "Mine's. Has to be. Small spaces, dangerous work nobody else wants to do. Kids are cheaper than men, and don't complain as much when the ceiling caves in." The conversation stopped as Matron Grimsby entered the hall, followed by a woman Eli had never seen before. Tall, maybe 30, with auburn hair and a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her mouth. She wore boys' clothes, canvas pants, work shirt, boots built for walking. Not the kind of woman you'd find in polite society. But it was her eyes that made Eli's skin crawl. Old eyes in a young face. Eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine and decided to keep looking anyway. "Children," Grimsby announced, "I'd like you to meet Miss Clara Donovan. She'll be accompanying those of you selected for placement, ensuring your safe journey to your new homes." Clara's gaze swept the room, cataloging faces with the same professional interest a butcher might show when examining livestock. When her eyes met Eli's, he saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe. Or warning. "The following boys will report to the front hall immediately," Grimsby continued, unfolding a sheet of paper. "Ashford, Eli." No surprise there. Eli set down his spoon and stood. "Oates, Milo." Milo's face went white, but he got to his feet without a word. The list continued. 38 more names, including Fisher with his burned hands and Matthews with his empty head. The boys not called looked relieved, then guilty about feeling relieved. The ones on the list just looked scared. "Gather your belongings and report to the front hall in 20 minutes, Grimsby said. "Don't keep the train waiting." As the selected boys filed out, Eli caught Clara watching him again. This time, she was close enough that he could hear her whisper, "Some of you might actually make it. Question is whether you're smart enough to run when the time comes." The words hit him like a slap. She knew. Whatever was waiting for them, Clara Donovan knew exactly what they were walking into. The front hall was a chaos of frightened boys clutching their few possessions. Eli had managed to grab his extra shirt and the small knife he'd traded for 3 months back, contraband that could get him beaten but might keep him alive. Milo appeared beside him carrying nothing but the clothes on his back. "Travel light, travel fast," Milo said. "Learn that on the streets." Good thinking. Eli studied the other boys, looking for anyone else who might be useful. Most of them were crying or praying or both. Dead weight, just like Milo had said. But there in the corner stood Fisher, the pale boy with the burned hands. He wasn't crying. He was watching Clara Donovan with the intensity of a hawk watching a rabbit, and his hands, those scarred, careful hands, were moving in patterns Eli recognized. Sign language. "Well, I'll be damned," Milo breathed. He'd seen it too. Clara noticed Fisher's signing and responded with quick, precise gestures. A brief conversation passed between them, invisible to everyone else in the room. When it finished, Clara's expression had changed. Still hard, still dangerous, but with something else underneath. Something that might have been respect. Brother Morris appeared with a wooden crate full of metal tags. "Each boy takes one," he announced. "Wear it around your neck at all times. These identify you to your new families." Eli took his tag and read the number, 23. Below that, in smaller print, "Property of BlackRock Mining Concern, Colorado Territory." Mining concern. Not families. Not farms. Exactly what Milo had guessed, and probably 100 times worse than either of them imagined. "Well, boys," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly over the nervous chatter, "time to see what the West has in store for you." She opened the front door, and beyond it waited a wagon with iron-barred sides. Not the kind of wagon you use to transport children to loving homes. The kind you use to transport prisoners. Or cargo. Eli felt Milo tense beside him. The smaller boy's street instincts were screaming at him to run, and Eli couldn't blame him. But where could they go? The city beyond those doors was just as dangerous as whatever waited in Colorado, and at least on the train they'd have each other. "Move along," Brother Morris said, prodding them with his stick. "Your transportation is waiting." One by one, the boys climbed into the barred wagon. Eli went near the end, helping Milo up and taking a spot where he could see through the bars. As the wagon lurched into motion, he caught one last glimpse of St. Augustine's home for wayward children. The place had been hell, but it was a hell he understood. Now they were heading for a different kind of hell entirely. Clara rode up front with the driver, her rifle across her knees and her eyes scanning the street ahead. Just before the wagon turned the corner, she looked back at the boys behind the bars and spoke just loud enough for Eli to hear. "I've been west before, children. They're not sending us to farms, they're sending us to die." Chapter 3. The cattle car they'd been loaded into still smelled of livestock and manure, despite the thin layer of sawdust someone had scattered on the floor. 40 boys packed into a space meant for freight, with 2 buckets for waste, and a single water barrel that already tasted of rust and desperation. "Home sweet home," Milo muttered, claiming a spot near the sliding door where cracks between the boards let in slivers of light and air. Eli settled beside him, watching the other boys sort themselves into the same hierarchies they'd maintained at the orphanage. The weak ones huddled in corners, while the bullies like Matthews claimed the best spots near the water. Human nature didn't change just because you put it on wheels. But Clara Donovan was different. She sat alone on a wooden crate near the door, her rifle across her knees, studying each boy with the patience of a naturalist cataloging species. When her eyes found Eli's, she nodded almost imperceptibly toward Fisher, who had positioned himself where he could see both the door and the other boys. Smart positioning. The pale kid understood something the others didn't. In a situation like this, information was more valuable than comfort. The train lurched into motion with a screech of metal on metal that made half the boys jump. Through the cracks in the walls, Eli caught glimpses of the city sliding past, tenements and factories giving way to farmland, then forest, then empty country that stretched toward horizons he'd never imagined. "Miss Donovan," Matthews called out after they'd been traveling for maybe an hour. At 16, he was the oldest and thought that made him important. "When do we eat? And where exactly are these farms we're going to?" Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Hungry already? That's unfortunate. Food comes twice a day, morning and evening. As for farms," she gestured toward the barred door. "Take a look around, boy. Do you see any farms out there?" Matthews pressed his face to the gaps between boards, squinting at the landscape rushing past. Nothing but rocks and scrub brush, empty country that looked like God had forgotten to finish it. "Maybe we ain't there yet," Matthews said, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. "Oh, you're not wrong about that," Clara said. 3 more days to Colorado territory. 3 days to think about what awaits you there." Fisher raised his hand, then remembered these weren't classroom rules and spoke anyway. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what do you know about where we're going?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara studied Fisher for a long moment, and Eli caught something pass between them, some shared understanding that excluded the rest of the boys. "Tell me, son," Clara said finally, "what do you know about mining?" "Not much," Fisher admitted. "Coal mines back east, I heard. Dangerous work." "Silver mines out west," Clara corrected. "Much more dangerous. The kind of dangerous that makes men rich and children dead." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The Blackrock Mining Concern owns 37 claims in the Colorado mountains. They pay good money for workers small enough to fit through tunnels where grown men can't go." The car went quiet, except for the rattling of wheels on track. Even Matthews had stopped posturing. "They call them tunnel rats," Clara continued. "Children who crawl through spaces no bigger than coffins, following silver veins deep into the mountain. Sometimes the tunnels collapse. Sometimes there are cave-ins. Sometimes the children just disappear." Milo's voice came out as a croak. "You're trying to scare us." "No," Clara said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I'm trying to prepare you. Because I've been where you're going, and I know what waits there." She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing scars that ran from wrist to elbow. Not the clean lines of knife cuts, but the jagged marks of crushing rock and twisted metal. 3 years ago, I was 15 and stupid enough to believe the same lies they told you. Got sent to Blackrock, along with 12 other girls from a Chicago workhouse." Her voice never wavered, but something cold moved behind her eyes. "I was the only one who came back." The silence that followed was broken only by the train's steady rhythm. Some of the younger boys were crying now, but quietly, like they were afraid making noise would make things worse. "If you knew," Eli said carefully, "why are you helping them do it again?" Clara's laugh had no humor in it. "Who says I'm helping?" Before anyone could ask what she meant, the train began to slow. Not a gradual deceleration, but a sudden grinding that threw several boys to the floor. Eli grabbed Milo's arm to keep him upright as the car shuddered and screamed to a halt. "What's happening?" Matthews demanded, trying to peer through the door cracks. Clara was already on her feet, rifle ready, listening to sounds from outside the car. Voices shouting. Horses whinnying. The distinctive rattle of men checking their weapons. "Everybody get down," she said, her voice cutting through the confusion. "Stay low and stay quiet." "You can't order us around," Matthews started to say, but the words died as Clara's rifle barrel swung toward him. "Boy, I can put a bullet through your brain before you finish that sentence. Now get down." The authority in her voice was absolute. Even Matthews dropped to his knees. Outside, the shouting was getting closer. Eli could make out individual words now, railroad and money and kill anyone who moves. Train robbery. Just like in the dime novels, except this wasn't entertainment. This was men with guns and nothing to lose, which made them the most dangerous kind. "Miss Donovan," Fisher whispered, "what do we do?" "We survive," Clara said simply. She moved to the door and peered through a crack. 6 men. Maybe 7. They're working their way up from the engine car. She looked back at the boys. "When this door opens, some of you are going to run. The smart ones will head for the trees and keep running until they can't run anymore." "What about you?" Eli asked. Clara's smile was grim. "I've got business with these particular gentlemen. Old business that needs settling." The sound of boots on gravel was getting closer. Eli could hear men talking in low, urgent voices, dividing up their tasks with the efficiency of professionals. "Remember," Clara whispered, "when I give the word, the smart ones run for the trees. The stupid ones stay and die." A shadow fell across the door cracks. Someone was right outside. "Clara Donovan," a man's voice called out, rough as sandpaper and twice as harsh. "I know you're in there, girl. Time to finish what we started 3 years ago." Clara's face went white, but her grip on the rifle never wavered. "Well, well. Iron Jack Kelligan himself. I was wondering when you'd show up. Open this door, Clara, and maybe some of these children live to see tomorrow." "Or maybe," Clara called back, "they all live to see tomorrow because you and your boys are about to have a real bad day." She looked at the boys huddled on the floor and mouthed one word, "Ready." Outside, Eli heard the metallic click of rifle bolts being worked. Kelligan's men were preparing for war. "Last chance, Clara," Kelligan shouted. "Open up, or we come in shooting." Clara's eyes found Eli's in the dim light of the cattle car. "When this door opens," she whispered, "chaos. Use it. Run for the trees and don't look back." The bar on the outside of the door scraped against metal as someone lifted it. Light began to seep in as the heavy door started to slide open. Clara raised her rifle to her shoulder and said quietly, "Now we find out who wants to live." The door slammed open completely, revealing 3 men with guns pointed at the car. Behind them, Eli caught a glimpse of Iron Jack Kelligan, tall, thin, with eyes like chips of winter ice. "Hello, Jack," Clara said and pulled the trigger. Chapter 4. Clara's rifle cracked like thunder in the confined space of the cattle car. The first man through the door spun sideways, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon clattering across the wooden floor. The second man got off one wild shot before Clara's next bullet took him in the chest. The third man was smarter. He dove sideways behind the door frame and started shooting blind into the car. "Move!" Clara shouted at the boys, working the bolt on her rifle with practiced speed. "Trees. Now." Eli grabbed Milo's shirt and hauled him toward the open door. Around them, chaos erupted as 40 terrified boys tried to escape through a space meant for cattle. Some froze in panic, others trampled their way forward, and a few had the sense to follow Clara's advice and head for the timber line 50 yards away. A bullet splinged off the door frame, inches from Eli's head as he leaped from the car. He hit the rocky ground hard, rolled, and came up running with Milo beside him. Behind them, more gunfire echoed from the train. Clara was still fighting, but she was one person against however many men Kelligan had brought. "This way," Milo gasped, angling toward a cluster of pine trees that offered the nearest cover. They'd made maybe 20 yards when a voice like gravel in a tin can called out behind them. "Stop right there, boys." Eli risked a glance back and saw Iron Jack Kelligan himself standing beside the cattle car, a long-barreled Colt in each hand. Up close, the man looked like death warmed over, tall and lean as a scarecrow, with silver hair and those pale blue eyes that seemed to see straight through you. "I said stop." Kelligan raised one of his pistols and put a bullet into the ground 5 feet ahead of them. Eli and Milo skidded to a halt. Around them, Other boys were doing the same, hands raised in surrender. Only a few had made it to the tree line, and even they seemed uncertain whether to keep running or come back. "That's better," Kelligan said, holstering one gun but keeping the other trained on the group. "Now then, where's our Miss Donovan gotten to?" The cattle car had gone quiet. Too quiet. "Clara," Kelligan called. "I know you're listening. Come out, and we'll discuss this like civilized people." No answer. Eli counted the seconds, wondering if Clara was dead or just being smart. Either way, she wasn't coming to save them. "Stubborn girl," Kelligan murmured, then raised his voice again. "Boys, anyone who helps me find Miss Donovan gets to walk away from this. Anyone who doesn't." He gestured with his pistol toward a man loading bodies onto a handcart near the engine. "Well, you can see what happens to folks who inconvenience me." Eli's stomach twisted. There were at least 4 bodies on that cart, including one in a conductor's uniform. Good people, dead because they'd been in the wrong place when Iron Jack Kelligan needed something. "Nobody's talking." Kelligan's voice carried a note of disappointment. "That's unfortunate. Means I'll have to start making examples." He walked slowly along the line of boys, studying each face like he was shopping for livestock. When he reached Fisher, he stopped. "You look like the nervous type, son. The kind who might know something useful." Fisher's burned hands were shaking, but he met Kelligan's eyes without flinching. "I don't know anything about Miss Donovan that you don't already know." "Is that so?" Kelligan's smile was cold as winter. "Well, let me tell you what I know. 3 years ago, Clara Donovan was supposed to die in a mine collapse at Black Rock. Instead, she killed 6 of my men and disappeared into the mountains. Cost me a lot of money, that girl did." He pressed the barrel of his pistol against Fisher's temple. "So when I heard she'd signed on to escort a trainload of fresh tunnel rats, I thought to myself, here's my chance to settle accounts. Question is, are you going to help me collect what she owes, or are you going to join her in hell?" The silence stretched like a wire ready to snap. Eli could see sweat beading on Fisher's forehead despite the cold mountain air, but the boy didn't break. Finally, Kelligan stepped back with a disgusted shake of his head. "Loyal to a fault, I see. Well, can't say I don't admire that in a—" The shot came from inside the cattle car, and Kelligan's hat went flying. The outlaw leader dove for cover behind the train wheels, cursing a blue streak. "Still alive, Jack?" Clara's voice rang out from somewhere in the darkness of the car. "Still causing you problems?" "Not for long." Kelligan snapped at his remaining men. "Burn her out." 2 of his gang members began splashing coal oil from the engine tender onto the sides of the cattle car. The smell of kerosene filled the air, sharp and dangerous. Eli saw his chance. While Kelligan's attention was focused on Clara, he caught Milo's eye and nodded toward the tree line. Milo understood immediately. They had maybe 30 seconds before someone noticed they were moving. "When I move," Eli whispered, "grab Fisher and run like hell." Before Milo could object, Eli was already in motion. Not toward the trees, but toward the cattle car where Clara was trapped. "Hey!" he shouted at Kelligan. "You want to know where she is? I can tell you." Every gun swung toward him. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept walking, hands raised, playing the part of a scared kid ready to sell out his protector. "She's got a hidey hole in the corner," he called out loud enough for Clara to hear. "Behind some loose boards. That's where she's been shooting from." Kelligan's men immediately began concentrating their fire on the corner Eli had indicated, the corner farthest from where Clara was actually hiding. In the confusion, Eli saw Milo and Fisher slip away toward the trees, along with several other boys who had the sense to use the distraction. But Kelligan wasn't fooled for long. "Nice try, boy," he said, raising his pistol. "But I don't think you know as much as you're pretending to." The gun was leveled straight at Eli's chest when the cattle car exploded into flame. The coal oil had caught, and suddenly the entire car was a roaring inferno that lit up the mountainside like a signal fire. In the chaos that followed, three things happened almost simultaneously. Clara came diving out of the burning car with her clothes smoking. Kelligan's men scattered to avoid the flames, and a new sound echoed across the mountains, the whistle of another train approaching from the west. "Company's coming, Jack," one of Kelligan's men shouted. "We need to move." But Kelligan's attention was fixed on Clara, who had rolled clear of the fire and was now facing him across 20 yards of open ground. She'd lost her rifle in the inferno, but there was a pistol in her hand and murder in her eyes. "3 years I've been hunting you," Kelligan said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. 3 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering when you'd show up to collect your revenge." "Wonder no more," Clara replied, and both guns spoke at once. Kelligan staggered, but didn't fall. Clara dropped to one knee, blood spreading across her shoulder. They'd both found their mark, but neither had made a killing shot. "Kill her," Kelligan ordered his men, but the approaching train whistle was getting louder, and his gang was already moving toward their horses. "Boss, we got to go," his lieutenant called. "That's a cavalry escort coming up the line." Kelligan looked from Clara to the approaching train, calculating odds like a gambler at a poker table. Finally, he spat into the dirt and holstered his smoking pistol. "This ain't over, Clara Donovan. Not by a long shot." He swung up onto his horse and looked directly at Eli, who was still standing in the open like a fool. "Find those brats," Kelligan shouted to his men. "Dead or alive. I want every last one of them." Then the Crimson Canyon gang was gone, disappearing into the timber like smoke on the wind. Behind them, they left a burning train, scattered children, and the bodies of innocent people who'd had the misfortune to be traveling west on the wrong day. Eli ran to where Clara knelt in the dirt, clutching her wounded shoulder. Blood seeped between her fingers, but her eyes were alert and angry. "How many got away?" she asked. Eli looked around at the chaos. Most of the boys were scattered to the four winds, but he could see maybe a dozen still visible near the tree line, too scared or too smart to venture back. "Maybe half," he said. "Milo and Fisher made it to the trees. Some others, too." Clara nodded grimly. "Then we did what we could." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. But Kelligan meant what he said. He'll hunt down every boy who escaped, and he won't stop until they're all dead or back in chains. The cavalry train was close enough now that Eli could see blue uniforms in the windows. Help was coming, but it might be too late for the boys who'd fled into the wilderness. "What do we do now?" Eli asked. Clara looked at the burning cattle car, then at the mountains where Kelligan had disappeared, then finally at Eli himself. "Now," she said, checking the loads in her pistol. "Now we go after them. Because those children are about to learn that the real danger isn't Iron Jack Kelligan. It's what's waiting for them in those mountains." Chapter 5. The Colorado wilderness had teeth, and it was already trying to eat them alive. Eli pushed through a wall of pine branches that scraped his face raw, following the sound of Milo's labored breathing somewhere ahead in the green darkness. They'd been climbing for 2 hours since fleeing the burning train, and the thin mountain air was making every step feel like running through molasses. Behind him, Fisher stumbled over a hidden root and went down hard on his knees. The pale boy had been struggling since they'd started the ascent, his burned hands making it difficult to grab branches for support when the trail got steep. "We need to rest," Fisher gasped, blood seeping through a tear in his pants leg. "Can't," Eli replied, though his own lungs were screaming for air. "Kelligan's men know these mountains. Every minute we stay in one place is a minute closer to getting caught." Milo appeared between two massive pines, his scarecrow frame swaying with exhaustion. "There's a creek about 50 yards ahead. We can drink and figure out where the hell we're going." The creek was barely a trickle of snowmelt running over black rocks, but it was the most beautiful thing Eli had seen since escaping the train. He knelt and cupped the icy water to his mouth, tasting pine and granite and something else, something that made his stomach clench with unease. "Tastes wrong," Milo said, echoing Eli's thoughts. He drunk his fill, but was staring at the water like it might bite him. Fisher dipped his burned hands into the stream, wincing as the cold hit his scars. "My grandmother used to say water tastes different when something's died upstream." "Cheerful thought," Eli muttered, but he stopped drinking. In a place like this, cheerful thoughts were luxuries they couldn't afford. The forest around them was dense enough to block out most of the afternoon sun, creating a twilight world of shadows and whispers. Every breeze through the branches sounded like voices. Every snapping twig could be a footstep. "How many others made it out?" Fisher asked, wrapping his wet hands in strips torn from his shirt. Eli had been asking himself the same question. During the chaos at the train, he'd seen maybe a dozen boys scatter into the trees, but that didn't mean they'd all survived the climb. The mountains were unforgiving to city children who'd never seen wilderness bigger than Central Park. "Don't know," he said finally. "But we can't worry about them right now. We've got enough problems keeping ourselves alive." As if to prove his point, a distant howl echoed through the forest. Not quite a wolf, not quite a dog, but something wild and hungry that made the hair on Eli's neck stand straight up. "Coyotes," Milo said, trying to sound casual and failing completely. Another howl answered the first, then another. Close enough that Eli could imagine yellow eyes watching them from the undergrowth. Close enough that running might not be an option. "We need higher ground," Fisher said quietly. "And we need fire." Smart thinking. Eli looked around at the towering pines and found what he was looking for, a rocky outcropping maybe 30 feet up the slope that would give them a view of the approaches and put their backs to stone instead of empty forest. "Up there," he said, pointing. "We can see them coming, and they can't circle behind us." The climb took 15 minutes that felt like an hour. By the time they reached the rocky shelf, all three boys were bleeding from scratches and gasping like landed fish. But the position was good. They could see down into the forest in 3 directions, and the fourth side was a cliff face too steep for anything to climb. Milo immediately began gathering dry pine needles and small branches for kindling. "Fire keeps most animals away," he said. "Learned that sleeping rough in New York." "Most animals," Fisher agreed. "But some are curious about fire. Some come to investigate." Before Eli could ask what he meant, movement in the trees below caught his attention. Something large and tawny was picking its way through the undergrowth with the fluid grace of a born predator. "Don't move," he whispered. The mountain lion was maybe 60 yards away, close enough that Eli could see the muscles rippling under its golden coat. It moved like liquid death, pausing every few steps to test the air with its black nose. "It's tracking us," Fisher breathed. The cat's head snapped up at the sound of his voice. Even from this distance, Eli could see its yellow eyes lock onto their position with predatory intelligence. This wasn't some dumb animal wandering through the woods. This was a hunter that had found prey. "Back away slow," Eli whispered. "Don't run unless I say run." But there was nowhere to back away to. Behind them was cliff face, and the rocky shelf was maybe 20 feet across at its widest point. They were trapped with a killer below and nowhere to go. The mountain lion began to climb. It moved up the slope with impossible grace, using its claws to find purchase on rocks that would challenge a human climber. Every step brought it closer, and every step made it look bigger and more lethal. "Fire," Milo said urgently, working his flint and steel over the pile of tinder. "Come on, you bastard, light." Sparks flew, but the pine needles were damp from mountain mist and wouldn't catch. Milo's hands were shaking now, whether from fear or cold, and the sparks were going wild. 20 yards. 15. Eli, Fisher said quietly. When it jumps, dive left. Cats can't change direction in midair. What about you? I'll figure something out. 10 yards. The mountain lion crouched low, its tail twitching as it calculated distance and angle. Its yellow eyes never left Eli's face, as if it had already decided which one of them would die first. A flame finally caught in Milo's tinder, but the fire was too small and too new to do any good. The cat showed no fear of the tiny blaze. If anything, it seemed annoyed by the smoke. 5 yards. The mountain lion's muscles bunched as it prepared to spring. Eli could see every detail now: the white fur around its muzzle, the pink inside its mouth as it opened to show fangs like ivory daggers, the intelligence behind those predatory eyes that marked it as something far more dangerous than any human enemy they might face. Now, Fisher shouted. But instead of diving, Eli grabbed a burning stick from Milo's fire and hurled it straight at the cat's face. The flaming branch struck the animal in the shoulder, scattering sparks and filling the air with the smell of singed fur. The mountain lion screamed, a sound like nothing Eli had ever heard, part rage and part pain and part something else entirely. It leaped backward, batting at the sparks with its paws, then turned and bounded away into the forest. But it didn't go far. Eli could see it maybe 50 yards down the slope, pacing back and forth like a sentry on patrol. Waiting. It's not giving up, Milo said, feeding more wood to the fire. It's just waiting for us to make a mistake. Fisher was studying the cat's movements with the intensity of a scholar reading Latin. It knows we can't stay here forever. No food, limited water. Time is on its side. So what do? We make it through the night, Eli said, settling in beside the fire. Then we figure out how to get down from here without becoming dinner. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the forest in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. But as darkness crept through the trees, the mountain lion's yellow eyes caught the firelight and gleamed like stars. And from somewhere deeper in the forest came another sound, the measured crack of branches under heavy boots. Men walking through the woods with purpose, following a trail. Company, Milo whispered. Eli strained his ears, counting footsteps. At least 3 men, maybe more. Moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Kelligan's boys, Fisher said. Has to be. Now they were trapped between a mountain lion that wanted to eat them and outlaws who wanted them dead. The fire that had saved them from the cat would also serve as a beacon for their human hunters. As if reading his thoughts, Milo began scattering dirt over the flames. Can't let them see the smoke. The cat, Fisher warned. Better to take our chances with claws than bullets, Eli said, helping to smother the fire. Darkness fell over them like a blanket, and in that darkness yellow eyes gleamed with patient hunger while boots continued their steady approach through the green hell that had become their prison. Somewhere in the distance, a child screamed. Chapter 6. It's still there. Milo said it like he was announcing yesterday's weather. Flat. Final. He didn't have to point. They all knew where the cat was, hunkered down in the blue-gray shadows of a spruce 50 yards off, watching them with the kind of patience only a killer could afford. Eli shifted his weight on the pine branch, sending a shower of needles down into the dark. His perch was 2/3 of the way up a tree that smelled of Christmas and sap, and every muscle in his back and legs screamed from the climb. It has to sleep sometime. You want to climb down and ask it when. Clara's voice was a low rasp from the tree next to his. She'd shimmied up hers with the speed of a squirrel, her bad ankle forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. Now she sat wedged in a crook of branches, looking less like a 15-year-old girl and more like something carved from the mountain itself. Hard and weathered, and not about to break. "It's playing with us," Milo said. His own tree was smaller, a sapling that swayed every time he breathed. "Cats play with things before they kill them. Saw one do it with a mouse on Mulberry Street once. Took an hour." "We're not mice," Eli said, trying to sound sure. The cougar below yawned, a flash of pink and white that looked impossibly wide. It stretched one massive paw, extending claws like curved daggers from the pads. Then it settled back onto its haunches, yellow eyes fixed on their trees. The message was clear. It had all night. "We need a fire," Eli said. "A big one. Scare it off." "With what?" Clara asked. "You got a pocket full of matches you forgot to mention." "Flint. A knife. Something." "I've got a knife," Milo said. "Traded a stale biscuit for it back at St. Augustine's. But I ain't climbing down there to rub sticks together while that thing watches." The woods had gone quiet. The birds had stopped their evening chatter. The squirrels had vanished. It was just them and the cat, locked in a standoff under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the peaks, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you think about how long a body could last before it just gave up. "It's not natural," Milo whispered, his voice tight. "Animals don't act like this. They hunt, they kill, they eat. They don't." "Wait. Maybe it's not hungry," Eli offered. "It's a predator," Clara countered. "They're always hungry." They fell silent again, listening to the wind sigh through the pines. It sounded like a woman crying, low and mournful. Eli tried to think, to make a plan, but his mind was a blank slate wiped clean by fear and exhaustion. All he could think about was the 50 yards of open ground between him and the cat. 50 yards of certain death. Hours passed. The moon rose, a sliver of bone white against the black, casting long, distorted shadows that turned the forest into a place of nightmares. The cougar hadn't moved. It was a statue of tawny fur and coiled muscle, a perfect killing machine waiting for its moment. Then Milo made a sound, a choked gasp that was half fear, half disbelief. "What is it?" Eli hissed, his eyes scanning the woods below. "The ridge," Milo breathed. "Look. Up on the ridge." Eli followed his gaze. Against the moonlit skyline, a figure stood motionless. It was tall, impossibly thin, and for a moment Eli thought it was just a dead tree, a trick of the light. Then it moved its head. It wasn't a tree. It was a man. Or something shaped like one. From its head things grew. Long branching things that clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. Not horns. Antlers. Twisted and wrong, like a deer that had been born in hell. Eli's blood went cold. He'd seen things in New York. Men with missing limbs, faces scarred by fire, eyes empty from drink or despair. But he'd never seen anything like this. This was a different kind of broken. "What the hell is that?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. The figure on the ridge didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. Or maybe it was watching the cat. Eli couldn't tell. It was too far away to see its face, but he could feel its eyes on him, a cold, heavy pressure that was worse than the cougar's predatory stare. "He's watching us," Milo said, his voice trembling. "The antler man." "Don't be stupid," Clara snapped, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "It's just a man. A hunter, maybe." "Hunters don't have trees growing out of their heads," Milo shot back. Down below, the cougar shifted. It rose to its feet, the movement fluid and silent. For a heart-stopping moment, Eli thought it was going to charge their trees. But it didn't. It turned its massive head and looked up at the ridge, at the antlered figure silhouetted against the moon. The two predators stared at each other across the silent valley. A conversation seemed to pass between them, a silent understanding that excluded the three children shivering in the trees. Then, with a flick of its tail, The cougar turned and melted into the darkness. It didn't run. It just left. One moment it was there, a solid presence of lethal intent, and the next it was gone, as if the mountain had swallowed it whole. For a long time, nobody spoke. The silence the cat left behind was louder than its growl had been. Finally, Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "It's gone." "What about him?" Milo asked, his eyes still fixed on the ridge. Eli looked up. The ridge was empty. The antler man was gone too. "We wait till sunrise," Clara said, her voice firm again, the moment of fear past. "We don't move until we can see what's out there." They waited. The cold was a physical thing now, a constant ache in their joints. Eli's stomach growled, a hollow, empty sound in the quiet woods. He thought about food, about a warm bed, about a world where things made sense. It felt a lifetime away. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the branches, they climbed down, their limbs stiff and clumsy. The ground was cold and damp under their worn-out shoes. The spot where the cougar had waited was just an empty patch of pine needles, as if it had never been there at all. "Let's go," Eli said, his voice hoarse. "East. Away from that ridge." They started walking, moving as quietly as they could through the undergrowth. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of fear through Eli. The forest didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath. It was Clara who found them. She stopped so suddenly that Eli bumped into her. She was staring at the ground, her face pale. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She just pointed. There in the soft earth, circling the base of the tree Eli had slept in, was a set of footprints. They were clear and deep, made by heavy boots. The tracks of a man who had stood there in the dark, watching them sleep. Eli followed the tracks with his eyes. They led from his tree to Milo's, then to Clara's. A complete circle. The man had inspected each of them, standing just a few feet below while they'd been trapped in the branches, their attention fixed on the cat. He had been there the whole time. Milo knelt and touched the edge of one of the prints, his fingers trembling. "He was watching us. While the cat was here, he was watching us." Clara looked back toward the ridge, her eyes narrowed. "The cat wasn't hunting us," she said, her voice low and tight with dawning horror. "It was cornering us, keeping us in the trees." Eli felt a new kind of fear, colder and sharper than anything he'd felt before. He looked down at the footprints, then back at the empty ridge where the antler man had stood. "Keeping us here for him," he whispered. A branch snapped in the woods nearby. Loud. Close. Eli grabbed Clara's arm. "Run." Chapter 7. Chapter 7. "You hear that?" Eli stopped, one hand grabbing a branch to steady himself on the steep incline. The only sound was his own ragged breath and the scuttling of a lizard across a rock. "Hear what?" "Nothing," Milo said, his voice a dry rasp. "That's what." "No birds. No squirrels. Nothing. Just us." He scanned the canopy of ponderosa pines, his city kid eyes wide with a suspicion that had been growing for 2 days. "It's like the whole woods is holding its breath." "Maybe it's just tired of listening to you," Clara said. She was leaning against a fat-trunked oak, trying to be casual about favoring her bad ankle. The swelling had gone down, but a purple-black bruise spread up from her boot. She hadn't complained once. Not when they'd run from the phantom boot prints, not when they'd spent another night shivering in a rock crevice, and not now, with their stomachs so empty they felt stuck to their spines. Eli knew what Milo meant, though. The forest felt wrong. Watched. They'd been pushing east since dawn, trying to put distance between them and the ridge, but the country was all the same. A green, silent maze of trees and rock that seemed to swallow sound. "We need water," Eli said, changing the subject. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. "And food that isn't pine nuts." They'd found a handful that morning, cracking the shells with a rock until their fingers were raw and sticky with pitch. It was enough to quiet the growling in their bellies, but not enough to be called a meal. Clara pushed herself off the tree. There's a creek on the other side of this rise. Or there should be. Water runs downhill. She started climbing again, pulling herself up by grabbing onto roots and saplings. She moved like she belonged here, like the mountain hadn't already tried to kill her once before. Eli and Milo followed. At the top of the rise, they looked down into a small shaded hollow. A thin ribbon of water, barely a foot wide, trickled over mossy stones. But that's not what caught Eli's eye. Halfway down the slope, nailed to the trunk of a massive oak, was a doll. It was one of Matron Grimsby's. A cheap thing with a porcelain face, yarn hair, and a faded calico dress, the kind she gave to the younger girls she wanted to impress during inspections. This one had been driven to the tree with a railroad spike through its chest. The force of the blow had cracked the porcelain face from forehead to chin. Rain and sap had mingled in the cracks, dripping down the pale cheeks in streaks that looked like bloody tears. "Jesus," Milo breathed, making a sign against evil he'd probably learned from an old Italian woman in the 5 Points. Clara walked toward it, her limp more pronounced now. She reached out and touched the doll's cracked face, her expression unreadable. "It's Marianne's," she said, her voice flat. "The little girl who cried on the train. The one conductor Murphy gave the apple to." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't random. This was a message. He looked around the hollow, at the silent trees, the deep shadows. Kelligan's men. "Maybe," Clara said, her eyes scanning the bark of the oak. "Or maybe someone else." She pointed to a spot just below the doll. Scratched into the wood were symbols, cut deep and fresh. One was a circle with a line through it. Next to it was a triangle, and then a crude drawing of what looked like a snake. "What is it?" Eli asked, moving closer. "Some kind of Indian sign?" "No," Clara said. "It's company script. The Blackrock mining concern used marks like these to survey claims. The circle means a played-out vein. The triangle is a warning for unstable ground." She ran a finger over the snake. "I don't know this one. It's new." Milo had gone pale. "It's a map. A warning. They're telling someone where to go. Or where not to." He looked back the way they'd come, his wiry frame tense as a coiled spring. "We're walking on their map." The silence of the woods pressed in on them. Eli could feel the hairs on his arms stand up. They weren't just lost anymore. They were trespassing. He looked from the doll to the strange carvings, trying to make sense of it. A dead girl's toy and a mining company's code. What did it mean? "We fill the canteens and we keep moving," he said, his voice sounding louder than he intended. "We get off their map." They scrambled down to the creek. The water was clear and cold, and they drank until their stomachs ached. As Eli was screwing the cap back on his canteen, he saw more marks carved into a smooth flat rock near the water's edge. The same circle, the same triangle. But this time, there were others. A square. A cross. And the snake, carved bigger and deeper than the one on the tree. "They're all over," Clara whispered. "Trail markers." "Or traps," Milo said. He was looking at a patch of disturbed leaves a few feet from the creek. Someone was here. Not long ago. Eli saw it too. A faint boot print, mostly scuffed out. And something else. A glint of color in the dirt. He knelt and picked it up. It was a button. A small brass button from the front of an orphan's jacket. Identical to the ones on his own worn-out coat. He held it out on his palm. "One of us was here." Before anyone could answer, a sound drifted down from the top of the hollow. Laughter. It was high and thin, the sound of children. But it was wrong. There was no joy in it. It was a wild, frantic sound, like the giggling of someone who'd been pushed past their breaking point. It echoed through the silent trees, then vanished as quickly as it had come. The three of them froze, crouched by the creek, listening. "Did you hear that?" Milo whispered, his eyes wide. "Other kids," Eli said. "Survivors from the train." "Or bait," Clara said, her hand resting on the hilt of the skinning knife she'd taken from a dead outlaw at the train wreck. The laughter came again, closer this time from the east. It was followed by a shout, a snatch of a song, then silence. It sounded like a game of hide-and-seek, played by ghosts. "We have to see," Eli said. He knew it was a risk. He knew it could be a trap. But the thought of other children out here, alone and terrified, was a weight he couldn't ignore. "They sound crazy," Milo argued. "Like they've gone feral." "Wouldn't you?" Eli countered. He started moving, creeping up the eastern slope of the hollow, using the trees for cover. Clara and Milo followed, their reluctance clear in every careful step. The woods on this side were thicker, the shadows deeper. After 100 yards, they came to a small clearing. A campfire, burned down to a pile of cold gray ash, sat in the center. Around it were signs of a recent camp. A discarded piece of hardtack, a strip of torn cloth, and more of the brass buttons, glinting in the dirt like lost coins. "They were here," Eli breathed. "Maybe a dozen of them, from the looks of it." "And they left in a hurry," Clara added, pointing to a half-eaten rabbit carcass lying near the fire pit, already swarming with flies. "Nobody leaves food behind, unless they have to." Milo knelt by the ashes, poking at them with a stick. "This fire's been out for a day. Maybe more." He looked around the clearing, his gaze lingering on the dark wall of trees that surrounded them. "It doesn't make sense." The laughter, it sounded like it was right here. Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The clearing was empty. The ashes were cold. But the sound had been real. He was sure of it. He took a step toward the far side of the clearing, his eyes scanning the ground. He was looking for tracks, for some sign of which way the other children had gone. That's when he saw it. A line scratched in the dirt, thin and barely visible. He followed it with his eyes. It led from the fire pit to the base of a large pine tree. He walked over to the tree. There, tied to a low-hanging branch with a piece of twine, was a small, crudely made bird whistle. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood. A metallic click echoed from the rocks above the clearing. Sharp, loud, the unmistakable sound of a rifle hammer being cocked. Chapter 8. Don't move. Clara's voice was so low it was barely a sound, but it hit Eli with the force of a slap. He froze, his hand hovering inches from the bird whistle. His eyes darted around the clearing, trying to pinpoint the source of the metallic click. The rocks above. The thicket of aspens to the left. The dark pines behind them. It could have come from anywhere. Milo had dropped into a crouch, making himself small, a ball of terrified energy ready to spring in any direction. "Who's there?" he hissed into the silence. Nothing. Only the wind, whispering through the tops of the trees. Eli slowly lowered his hand. The click had been real. He was sure of it. But there was no follow-up. No voice calling out. No bullet tearing through the air. A hunter would have shown himself. Kelligan's men would have started shooting. This was something else. "It was a rock," Clara said, her voice still tight but losing its sharpest edge. She pointed with her chin toward the rock face above them. A piece of shale. Slipped and hit another rock on the way down. Sounded like a hammer cocking. Eli wasn't sure he believed her. But what choice did they have? They couldn't stand here all day, waiting for a ghost to shoot them. "Let's get out of this clearing." They backed away slowly, moving from tree to tree, their eyes scanning the silent woods. The bird whistle still hung from its branch, a small, innocent-looking thing that felt like the most dangerous object in the world. They walked for another hour, pushing themselves, driven by a fear that had teeth. They didn't stop until they found a place that felt remotely defensible, a shallow overhang at the base of a granite cliff, with a clear view of the slope below and solid rock at their backs. Eli slid down the rock face, his legs trembling with exhaustion. Milo collapsed in a heap, pulling his knees to his chest. Clara stood watch for a few minutes, her gaze sweeping the terrain, before finally allowing herself to sit, her back against the rock, the skinning knife resting on her thigh. For a long time, the only sounds were their own ragged breaths. The hunger was a physical pain now, a dull, constant ache deep in their bellies. The fear had settled from a sharp panic into a low, grinding dread. Milo broke the silence. He was staring at Clara, his eyes narrowed. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. "Back at the tree with the doll. Those marks. You knew what they were." Clara didn't look at him. She was watching a hawk circle in the vast blue sky above them. "Knowing and talking are two different things," she said. "Talking gets you killed." "Not talking is what's getting us killed now," Eli said, pushing himself up. "We're walking blind. We saw a dead girl's doll nailed to a tree. We found company survey marks in the middle of nowhere. We heard children laughing where there weren't any children. And someone or something is leaving us toys to find. We need to know what we're running from, Clara." Clara's gaze dropped from the sky and met his. Her eyes were old, filled with a weariness that didn't belong on a 15-year-old's face. "You want to know?" she asked, her voice quiet. "You're sure?" Eli nodded. She took a deep breath, the kind you take before diving into deep, cold water. "The marks are from the Blackrock mining concern." The doll was a message. "And the laughter. The laughter is what happens when you spend too much time in the dark." She pulled up the sleeve of her worn shirt, revealing the scars on her forearm. They weren't just from ropes. They were a pale, tangled roadmap of cuts, burns, and scrapes. "I told you I was in a mining camp," she began. "It wasn't a camp. It was a grave they sent us into every morning. A hole in the ground that swallowed kids and spat out silver." She told them everything. About the orphan train that had brought her west 2 years before, filled with the same lies about good homes and loving families. About the camp, high in the mountains, a collection of tar paper shacks and misery surrounded by armed guards. About the work. "They called us tunnel rats," she said, her voice a monotone, as if she were reciting a story about someone else. "The silver veins were thin. Too thin for a man to follow. So they used us. Kids as young as 8. We'd crawl for hours in tunnels no bigger than a coffin, with a candle stub for light and a small hammer to chip away the rock. The dust, you breathed it, you ate it, you slept in it. It got in your lungs until you started coughing up blood." Milo had gone still, his earlier anger replaced by a horrified fascination. "The collapses were the worst part," Clara continued, her eyes focused on some distant point in her memory. "The mountain was unstable. The company was too cheap to shore up the tunnels properly. You'd be working, and you'd hear a groan from the rock above you, and you'd know. Sometimes you could scramble out. Sometimes you couldn't. We lost 6 kids that first winter." "And nobody did anything?" Eli asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "Who was going to? The guards were paid to keep us there. The company owned the nearest town, the nearest lawman. To them, we were just equipment. Cheaper to replace than a broken pickaxe." She paused, picking up a small, sharp stone and turning it over and over in her fingers. "But the collapses weren't the only thing we were afraid of. There was the foreman." "The antler man," Milo breathed. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. "Where did you hear that name?" I don't know," Milo stammered. "It's just what I thought when I saw him. On the ridge." Clara stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "He wasn't always like that. When I first got there, his name was Marcus Oates. He was a hard man, but he was just a man. He ran the tunnels, pushed us to work faster, but he wasn't a monster." She looked down at the stone in her hand. "The mountain made him one." "What happened?" Eli asked. "A big collapse. Level 3. Took out a whole section of the mine. Oates was in it, along with a dozen men and 4 of our boys. It took them 3 days to dig him out. He was the only one they found alive." Her voice dropped lower. "When they brought him to the surface, he wasn't right. The timbering had crushed the side of his head. The company doctor, a drunk who knew more about horses than people, pulled out what pieces of wood and rock he could. But some of it was embedded too deep in his skull. It healed over like that." She looked up, her eyes dark. "It looked like a crown made of rock and splintered bone. Like antlers." He stopped talking for a month. When he started again, he wasn't making sense. He'd talk about the mountain being alive. About it being hungry. He said the collapse wasn't an accident. It was a sacrifice. And the mountain wanted more. Eli felt the blood drain from his face. "That's when he started marking the woods," Clara said. "The circles, the triangles. His own private map. And the snake, that was his mark. It meant a place he'd chosen. A place for the mountain." "And the children?" Milo asked, his voice trembling. "They started disappearing," Clara said flatly. 1 or 2 a month. Oates would say they ran off. But we knew. He was taking them back into the deep tunnels, as an offering. We could hear them sometimes, at night. Crying. Laughing. That same empty sound we heard today. He was leaving the dolls and the toys as markers for the others. For the ones who understood the signs. A warning to stay away. Or an invitation. "So you ran," Eli said. "I did more than run," she said, a flicker of the fire returning to her eyes. "I waited for the first big snow of the season. Waited until the company brought in the winter supply of blasting powder. I set a fire in the powder shed. The whole camp went up. In the chaos, I got a few of the other kids out. We ran for 3 days before we hit a settlement." She fell silent. The story hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. A mad foreman with a head full of rock, a hungry mountain, and ghost children laughing in the dark. It was all too much to believe. And yet, it explained everything. "So he's still out there," Eli said, the pieces clicking into place. "Hunting. And Kelligan, he was bringing him fresh sacrifices." "Kelligan works for the company," Clara confirmed. "He provides the labor. Oates is just the ghost that keeps the other kids in line. The boogeyman they tell stories about, to stop them from running." Milo was staring past her, his face ashen, his mouth slightly open. He looked like he'd seen a ghost himself. "Milo," Eli said. "What is it?" Milo didn't answer. He just slowly, shakily, raised a trembling hand and pointed. Eli and Clara turned, following his gaze. Across the valley, on the crest of a distant, sun-drenched hill, a lone figure stood silhouetted against the bright blue sky. It was tall and thin. And even from a mile away, they could see the jagged, branching crown that grew from its skull. It stood perfectly still, watching them. Chapter 9. "He's gone." Milo said it, but he didn't sound convinced. He was still staring at the empty hilltop. A silhouette burned into his eyes. He was right there. He was watching us. "And now he's not," Clara said, her voice sharp as flint. She was already moving, scrambling down from their perch. Which means he's either given up, or he's on his way down. I'm not betting on the first one. Eli pushed himself to his feet, a wave of dizziness washing over him. The world tilted, the pine trees swaying like drunks. He put a hand out to the rock face, to steady himself. His skin was hot, dry as paper. Eli. Clara was looking at him, her eyes narrowed. You all right? Fine, he lied, his voice a croak. Let's go. He took 2 steps, and his legs went out from under him. He didn't fall so much as fold, collapsing into a heap of worn-out boots and shaking limbs. The ground felt like a furnace, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. Milo was beside him in an instant. What is it? What's wrong? He's burning up, Clara said. She knelt and pushed back the sleeve of Eli's shirt. The scratches they'd all gotten crashing through the undergrowth 2 days ago were no longer thin red lines on his arm. They were angry, swollen welts, puffy and purple at the edges, with dark streaks spiderwebbing toward his shoulder. Damn it. Thornapple. Or mountain laurel. Something poison. Poison. Milo backed away, a step. Is he gonna die? Not if I can help it, Clara said, but her face was grim. We need to cool him down. We need to stop. Stop. Milo's voice cracked. Here. With that thing walking around. He'll find us in an hour. He pointed a trembling finger back toward the hill where the figure had stood. That's what he wants. For us to be slow. To be weak. And what do you want to do, Milo? Clara shot back, her voice dangerously quiet. Leave him here. Let him die alone, so you can run a little faster. He's a liability, Milo whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. In the city, you cut your losses. You have to. This isn't the city, Clara said, her gaze hard as granite. Out here, you leave someone behind, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. You become one of them. Eli heard their voices as if from a great distance, muffled and distorted, like they were shouting at him from the other side of a thick wall. The pain in his arm was a living thing, a hot coal buried in his flesh. He closed his eyes and saw the doll's cracked face, sap weeping from the wound. He felt himself being lifted, dragged. Milo on one side, Clara on the other, half carrying him through the trees. Every step was a jolt that sent fire through his veins. The world became a blur of green and brown, a nauseating smear of color. He tried to keep his feet under him, tried to help, but his legs were useless things, tangled ropes that wouldn't obey. They found a hollow, a depression in the earth where a great tree had been uprooted years ago, leaving a shallow pit walled by its massive gnarled roots. It wasn't much, but it was out of sight. They laid him down on the cool, damp earth. Water, Clara commanded. Milo fumbled with a canteen, handing it to her. She uncorked it and poured a little of the precious water onto a strip of cloth she tore from the hem of her shirt. She began to clean the wounds on Eli's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. It's not enough, she muttered, more to herself than to Milo. The poison's in his blood. Eli's world had shrunk to the space behind his own eyes. The pain was a constant, throbbing drumbeat. And the visions were starting. He saw the dormitory at St. Augustine's, the rows of gray cots, but the air was thick with smoke. The other boys were in their beds, their faces pale and still, but their clothes were on fire, burning with a cold white flame that consumed but didn't char. Matron Grimsby walked between the cots, her face a mask of indifference, her black dress trailing embers. Pack your things, boy, she said, her voice the scrape of metal on stone. You leave on tomorrow's train. The sound of train wheels filled his head, a relentless clatter that matched the pounding in his skull. He was in the cattle car again, but the walls were closing in, the air thick with the smell of coal dust and something else, something sweet and rotten. The other children were there, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide and empty. They were singing, a nursery rhyme he couldn't quite remember, their voices flat and tuneless. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. He tried to scream, but the dust filled his mouth, choking him. He's shaking, Milo's voice said, cutting through the nightmare. His teeth are chattering, but he's burning up. It's the fever, Clara's voice replied, tight with worry. It'll get worse before it gets better. If it gets better. The vision shifted. He was in a tunnel, a tight black space that smelled of damp earth and fear. He was crawling, his fingers raw, the rock scraping his skin. A candle stub flickered ahead, casting a weak yellow light. In the light, he saw a man's back. A foreman. The man turned, and his face was normal, just a man named Oates with tired eyes and a hard mouth. Then the world groaned. A deep, grinding sound from the heart of the mountain. The foreman's face looked up, his eyes wide with sudden terror. The candle went out. In the absolute darkness, Eli heard the splintering of timber, the shriek of tortured rock. When the light returned, it was different. A cold, dead light. The foreman was still there, but his face was a ruin, a crater of shattered bone and embedded rock. And from the wound in his skull, something was growing. A crown of stone and wood. The foreman opened his mouth, and a voice came out that wasn't a voice at all. It was the sound of rocks grinding together, of earth shifting in the deep places. It was a language Eli had never heard, but somehow understood. The language of the mountain. It spoke of hunger, of sacrifice, of children's bones ground to dust. Eli thrashed, trying to get away, his arms flailing. Hold him down, Clara yelled. He felt hands on his shoulders, pinning him to the earth. He fought against them, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He had to get out. The walls were closing in. The mountain was hungry. Eli. It's us. Clara's voice was in his ear, sharp and clear, a pinprick of reality in the swirling madness. It's a dream. Fight it. He forced his eyes open. For a second he saw her face, smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with fear. Then the fever pulled him back under. He was in the clearing again. The bird whistle hung from the tree, twisting slowly in a wind that made no sound. The ashes of the campfire stirred, and from them rose the children. A dozen of them, their forms made of smoke and memory, their eyes hollow. They turned their heads in unison and looked at him. They didn't speak. They just pointed. Eli followed their gaze. At the edge of the root hollow, standing half hidden behind the trunk of an ancient pine, was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in the tattered remains of a foreman's clothes. His face was a road map of scars, a pale mask in the dappled sunlight. And from his skull grew the jagged crown of rock and splintered bone. The Antler Man. He wasn't a vision. He wasn't a dream. He was there. Real as the pain in Eli's arm, real as the fear in his gut. He stood perfectly still, watching them with an unnerving patience, his head cocked slightly, as if listening to a conversation only he could hear. Eli's heart seized in his chest. He tried to shout, to warn Clara, to tell Milo that their nightmare was standing 10 feet away. He opened his mouth, drew in a burning breath, and pushed the sound out. Nothing came. His throat was raw, his voice was a ghost. No sound emerged but a dry, rasping hiss. He watched, helpless, as the figure took a slow, deliberate step out from behind the tree. Chapter 10. The man took a step, and the world came rushing back into focus with the sharp, brutal sound of a knife being drawn. Clara was on her feet, a low crouch, the skinning knife held low and steady in her hand. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Milo had scrambled backward, crab-walking through the dirt, until his back hit the gnarled roots of the fallen tree, his eyes wide and white in his grimy face. He looked like a cornered rat. Eli was still on the ground, the fever a roaring furnace in his head, but the sight of the man, the realness of him, was a bucket of ice water on his soul. He could see the details now. The foreman's clothes were not just tattered, they were stiff with old blood and dirt. The scars on his face were a tangled web, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent gruesome smile. And the thing on his head wasn't antlers. It was a misshapen helmet of rock and bone and splintered wood, fused to his skull, a permanent crown from his own tomb. The man Oates stopped. He wasn't looking at Clara and her knife. He wasn't looking at Milo cowering by the roots. His eyes, pale and flat as creek stones, were fixed on Eli. He tilted his head, the movement stiff, unnatural. The grotesque smile widened. Then he raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that might have been a wave. He held it there for a 3 count, a silent, mocking greeting. And then he was gone. He didn't run. He simply stepped back behind the pine, and when Clara lunged past Eli to look, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows and the oppressive silence of the mountains. The tension broke. The air rushed back into Eli's lungs, and he passed out. He woke to the taste of rust and wet cloth. The fever was still there, a dull, throbbing ache behind his eyes, but the fire had banked. He could think. He was lying with his head in Clara's lap. She was dabbing his forehead with a damp rag. Milo was a few feet away, sharpening a stick with his small knife, his movements jerky and angry. "He was here," Eli rasped, his throat raw. "I know," Clara said. She didn't look at him, her attention focused on the horizon. "We're moving, as soon as you can stand." It took an hour. An hour of sipping water, of Clara forcing him to chew on some bitter leaves she'd found that she said would fight the poison. They tasted like dirt and regret, but a sliver of strength returned to his limbs. He got to his feet, swaying, the world still a little fuzzy at the edges, but he was upright. "Which way?" he asked. "Away from here," was all she said. They walked all afternoon, a miserable, stumbling march. Eli felt like a ghost, his body a clumsy machine he was no longer in control of. The memory of the fever was a waking nightmare. He kept seeing things in the shadows, the glint of Oates's pale eyes, the jagged shape of his crown. He knew they were tricks of the light, fever phantoms, but that didn't stop the cold dread from coiling in his stomach. Oates was playing with them. He wasn't hunting to kill. Not yet. He was hurting them, pushing them, enjoying the fear. The tokens started that evening. The first one was a bird's skull, stripped clean, placed neatly on a bed of moss right in the middle of their path. It was so obviously deliberate that they all stopped dead. "What is it?" Milo asked, his voice a whisper. "A message," Clara said, her jaw tight. She kicked the skull off the path, where it disappeared into the undergrowth. "It means he's close. It means he's watching. Keep moving." An hour later, they found the second. A single perfect hawk feather, pinned to the trunk of an aspen with a long black thorn. It pointed east, the direction they were headed. "He's telling us which way to go," Eli said, the words leaving a bad taste in his mouth. "He's mocking us," Clara corrected. The third token was the one that broke Milo. They had stopped to rest in a small clearing, as dusk began to settle, the sky turning a bruised purple. Eli was checking their last canteen of water when Milo let out a choked cry. He was staring at a low-hanging branch on a spruce tree. Hanging from the branch by a piece of twine was a small, tarnished brass button, the kind from an orphan's jacket. And tied to the button with a strand of dirty yarn was a single, small white tooth. A child's tooth. Milo stared at it, his face slack with a horror that went beyond fear. He had seen death in the city. He had seen violence. But this was different. This was a particular kind of cruelty, a patient, deliberate evil that felt ancient as the mountains. "No," he whispered. "No more." "Milo, don't look at it," Clara said, her voice soft for the first time since the train. But he couldn't look away. "It's a game," he said, his voice rising, cracking with hysteria. "It's just a game to him. He's leaving us presents. Like we're his pets. He turned on Clara, his eyes wild. And you led us right to him. This is your ghost, your story. You brought us here. That's not true, Clara said, her own face pale. Isn't it? Milo shot back. He's not after us. He's after you. We're just in the way. Shut up, Milo, Eli said, finding his voice. She's the only reason we're still alive. Alive? Milo laughed, a high, unhinged sound that made the birds in the trees fall silent. This isn't living. This is waiting to die. I'm done waiting. Before either of them could react, he bolted. He scrambled out of the clearing and plunged into the woods, running blindly, crashing through brush with the reckless abandon of a panicked deer. Milo, wait. Eli shouted, stumbling after him. Let him go, Clara said, grabbing Eli's arm. Her grip was like iron. He's a fool. He'll get himself killed. We can't just leave him, Eli said, pulling his arm free. That's what Oates wants. For us to split up. To be alone. Clara hesitated, her face a conflict of cold pragmatism and something else, something that might have been loyalty. He'll be impossible to track in the dark. Then we'd better hurry, Eli said, and started after him, following the sound of breaking branches. They spent the last hour of daylight tracking him. It wasn't hard. Milo was running on pure fear, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. They found a piece of his torn shirt, a scuffed boot print where he'd slipped on a rock. But the sounds of his flight had faded. The woods were silent again. The sun was gone, the world painted in shades of gray and black when they found him. His tracks had led them to a place the woods had tried to hide. A perfect circle of waist-high white stones, gleaming in the moonlight. They were quartz, maybe, stark and unnatural against the dark earth. The air inside the circle felt cold, still. Milo was standing in the exact center of it. He wasn't moving. He was standing stiff as a fence post, his arms at his sides, his head tilted up. He was staring, not at anything, but at nothing, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the pale moonlight. Milo. Eli called out softly. No response. He and Clara exchanged a look and walked slowly into the circle of stones. The ground was soft under their feet. As they got closer, they could hear a sound coming from Milo, a low, rhythmic whimpering, like a dog having a bad dream. Clara reached him first. She put a hand on his shoulder. Milo. It's us. He didn't flinch. He didn't seem to notice she was there. Eli came up on his other side and grabbed his arm. It was rigid, cold. Milo, snap out of it, he said, shaking him. The shaking seemed to break the spell. Milo's head snapped down. He looked at Eli, then at Clara, but his eyes didn't seem to be focusing. They were still staring at something they had seen, something that had burned itself onto the back of his mind. He shuddered, a violent, full-body tremor. His lips moved, forming a word that came out as a dry, terrified whisper. Tonight. What about tonight? Clara asked, her voice sharp. Milo's eyes finally focused on them, and what they saw in his face made Eli's blood run cold. It was a terror so profound, it had burned past screaming. He's coming for us, Milo whispered, his voice trembling, broken. He's done playing. He's coming for us tonight. Chapter 11. What did you see? Clara's voice cut through the cold air, sharp as a shard of glass. She had Milo by the front of his shirt, her knuckles white. Talk. Now. Milo's eyes were still wide, fixed on the dark wall of trees that ringed the stone circle. Him, he choked out, a tremor running through his wiry frame. Just for a second. Between the pines. He was watching us. He smiled. The memory of it seemed to break him. It wasn't a real smile. Eli pushed himself away from the quartz stone he was leaning on. The fever had left him hollowed out, his joints aching, but the adrenaline was a fire in his veins. "Are you sure, Milo? The moonlight plays tricks." "It was him," Milo insisted, his voice a ragged whisper. "He knows where we are. He's coming." A rifle shot cracked through the night. It wasn't a boom. It was a flat, hard crack that echoed off the distant peaks and slapped them in the face. It was close. Too close. Clara didn't hesitate. She shoved Milo toward the far side of the circle. "Go. Now. Into the trees." They scrambled over the low stones, plunging back into the darkness of the forest. They ran without thinking, fueled by a fresh wave of terror. This was different from the creeping dread Oates inspired. This was immediate. A rifle meant a man, and a man with a rifle in these mountains was a hunter. And they were the only game in sight. Branches whipped at their faces, roots grabbed at their ankles. Eli stumbled, his weak legs protesting, but Clara hauled him up without breaking stride. She was in her element now, moving with a grim purpose, her eyes scanning the terrain even as they fled. They ran until their lungs burned, and the sound of their own ragged breathing was louder than the pounding of their feet. Clara finally pulled them to a halt in a dense thicket of aspen, their white trunks like ghostly bars in the moonlight. "Did you see a muzzle flash?" she whispered, her breath coming in short, controlled puffs. Eli shook his head, trying to quiet the hammering in his chest. "It came from the north. I think." "One shot," Clara said, thinking aloud. Not a warning. A kill shot. He missed. Or he hit what he was aiming for. "What if it was Oates?" Milo asked, his voice trembling. "What if he has a rifle?" "Oates doesn't use a rifle," Clara said with a certainty that chilled Eli to the bone. "He doesn't need one." They stayed hidden for what felt like an hour, listening. The forest had gone dead silent again. No crickets, no nightbirds. Just the whisper of the wind, high in the pines. The silence was worse than the shot had been. It was a waiting silence. "We can't stay here," Clara said finally. "Whoever that was, he's between us and the way out. We have to go around. West." She took the lead, moving with a quiet, efficient grace. She wasn't just walking, she was reading the ground, her eyes darting from side to side. After a few hundred yards she stopped, kneeling beside a patch of trampled ferns. "Blood," she said, touching a dark, wet leaf with her fingertips. She brought them to her nose and sniffed. "Elk." He hit his target. Eli looked at the blood, a dark spatter on the green leaves. A wave of relief washed over him. So, he wasn't shooting at us. "Don't be a fool," Clara said, her eyes cold in the moonlight. "He was shooting near us. He knows we're here. He just had other business first." She pointed to the ground. "Look." Beside the blood was a set of boot prints, clear in the soft earth. They were large, made by a heavy man. The heel was worn down on one side. "That's not Oates's track," she said. "His is smaller. And he walks with his weight on the balls of his feet. Like a predator. This man is a hunter. He's carrying a heavy pack and a long rifle." "How do you know that?" Milo asked, his voice full of a new, grudging respect. "Because I know how to look," Clara said, standing up. "And I know this pattern. See how the elk's tracks are splayed out? It was running hard. But see the man's. They're calm. Measured. He's not chasing it. He's driving it. Pushing it toward a place where he knows it will go. A box canyon, a riverbank. A kill zone." She looked west into the deep dark woods. "He knows this land. And he's moving parallel to us." They started walking again, a new kind of fear settling over them. Oates was a monster, a ghost from a nightmare. But this was a man. A real man with a rifle and a skill that felt just as dangerous. They moved in a crouch, sticking to the shadows, trying to make no sound. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind sounded like a man's whisper. Eli's fever was a dull throb now, a constant reminder of his own weakness. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping up with Clara's relentless pace. They found the cave just before dawn. It wasn't much, just a deep fissure in a granite rock face, half hidden by a curtain of overgrown ivy. It smelled of damp earth and bats. "In here," Clara whispered, pulling back the ivy. "It'll have to do." The space was narrow and cramped. They huddled together in the darkness, the cold of the rock seeping into their bones. They were exhausted, hungry, and trapped. They listened as the sun came up, painting the world outside in shades of gray and pink. They heard the birds start to sing again. The forest was coming back to life. Then they heard a new sound. Whistling. It was a casual, carefree sound. A man whistling a jaunty, off-key tune as he walked through the woods. The sound grew closer, moving along the base of the rock face. It was the sound of a man without a worry in the world. A man who knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He pressed himself deeper into the fissure, trying to become part of the rock. The whistling stopped directly outside their hiding spot. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then the ivy curtain was pushed aside. Sunlight streamed into the cave, blinding them. All Eli could see was a silhouette. A pair of worn, dusty boots. The long, dark barrel of a rifle, held loosely in one hand. Chapter 12. Mornin'. The voice was rough gravel, but quiet. Not a shout. Not a threat. Just a statement of fact. The sun was up, and he was here. The silhouette shifted, stepping into the cave. The blinding light resolved into a man. He was older than Eli had expected. His face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and wind, a thick beard the color of dirty snow covering the lower half of it. But his eyes were what held you. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they seemed to take in everything at once, the three scared children, the cramped space, the fear thick enough to taste without surprise. He held the long rifle like it was part of his arm, its stock worn smooth with use. Clara moved, a blur of motion, putting herself between the man and the two boys. She held the skinning knife out, the blade looking small and pathetic against the rifle. "Stay back." The man's pale eyes flicked to the knife, then back to her face. A corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That's for skinnin' rabbits, girl. Not men." He didn't raise the rifle. He just stood there, filling the entrance to their small world. "You're making a mess of my woods." "Your woods?" Clara shot back, her voice tight. "My woods," the man repeated, calm as a Sunday morning. "Been huntin' this stretch for 20 years. Know every rock, every tree. Know the game. And you three, you ain't game. You're just loud." He shifted his gaze to Eli, and those pale eyes seemed to see right through him, noting the fever sheen on his skin, the tremor in his hands. "This one's sick. Poisoned." "He's fine," Clara lied. The man grunted. "He's about 2 days from seeing his own funeral. The mountain has its own rules. You break 'em, you pay a debt." He looked them over, one by one. "Looks to me like you three have been breaking all sorts of rules." "We're just passing through," Eli said, his voice a hoarse croak. He tried to get up, to stand with Clara, but his legs wouldn't hold him. "Passing through from where?" the hunter asked. "That train wreck back east. The one Kelligan's boys hit." The name hit them like a physical blow. Milo let out a small, choked sound. "Heard the shootin'," the man continued, his voice conversational. "Heard Kelligan was looking for some stray cargo that got loose. Figured you'd end up here. Everyone running from something ends up here." "We don't know any Kelligan," Clara said, her voice hard. The man's pale eyes settled on her. "Girl, you can lie to yourself. You can lie to these boys. But you lied to me in my own woods, and all you'll do is die tired." He leaned the rifle against the rock wall, a gesture of either trust or supreme confidence. "Name's Jonas Blackwood, and you're on my land. Now, you gonna tell me who you're running from? The man with the guns, or the one without?" The question hung in the air. The man with the guns, Kelligan, or the one without, Thorne? How did he know about Thorne? Clara hesitated, her resolve wavering for the first time. This man, Jonas, knew things he shouldn't. "Both," Eli said, finding his voice. "We're running from both." Jonas Blackwood nodded slowly, as if this was the only answer that made sense. "Debts," he said, more to himself than to them. "Everyone's got them. Some are paid in coin. Some are paid in blood. The old ways are best. An eye for an eye. A soul for a soul." He looked at the three of them, his gaze lingering on their ragged clothes, their gaunt faces. "You're hungry." It wasn't a question. He turned and walked out of the cave. For a moment, they thought he was leaving. Then he returned, holding something in his hand. It was a roasted rabbit, cooked on a spit, its skin crisp and brown. The smell hit Eli's empty stomach like a punch, a rich, meaty aroma that was the most beautiful thing he had ever smelled. Jonas pulled a long knife from a sheath on his belt and carved off a piece of the meat, holding it out on the flat of the blade to Clara. She stared at the meat, then at him, her eyes full of suspicion. "Why?" "Because the mountain provides," Jonas said simply. "And because a starving dog is a desperate dog. I don't like desperate things in my woods. They're unpredictable." Clara took the meat. She tore off a small piece and chewed it slowly, her eyes never leaving his face, as if expecting it to be poisoned. Then she passed the rest to Eli. The meat was hot, greasy, and salty. It was the best thing Eli had ever tasted. He devoured it in 3 bites, the flavor exploding in his mouth, sending a jolt of life through his exhausted body. Jonas carved more, handing pieces to Milo, who took it without a word, his eyes still wide with fear. They ate in silence, a raw, primal hunger driving them. Jonas watched them, his expression unreadable, a strange mix of pity and calculation in his pale blue eyes. When they were finished, he corked the canteen on his hip and handed it to Eli. "Drink. Willow bark tea. Good for the fever." The tea was bitter, but cool and clean. Eli drank it all. "Now," Jonas said, wiping his knife on his leather trousers. "We go." "Go where?" Clara asked, getting to her feet, the skinning knife still in her hand. "My place. It's another half-day's walk." He looked at Eli. "He won't make it that far on his own. But he'll die for sure if he stays here. Your choice." He picked up his rifle and started walking, not looking back to see if they were following. Clara and Eli exchanged a look. This man was dangerous. Everything about him screamed it, from the easy way he held his rifle to the cold certainty in his eyes. But the rabbit had been real. The tea was real. And the alternative was staying here, waiting for Kelligan's men to find them, or for Thorne to leave another one of his gruesome tokens. "We go," Eli said. They followed him. Jonas Blackwood moved through the forest with a quiet, rolling gait, his worn boots making almost no sound on the pine needles. He didn't seem to be following a trail, but he moved with an unerring sense of direction, weaving through the trees as if he were walking down a familiar street. The tea, or maybe the food, was working. The world was starting to feel solid again under Eli's feet. The worst of the fever seemed to have broken, leaving him weak and shaky but clear-headed. He watched Jonas, trying to figure him out. The man spoke in riddles about debts and old ways, but he moved with a brutal efficiency. He was a part of this wilderness, as much as the rocks and the trees. And that made him more dangerous than any city-bred killer. As they walked, Eli started to notice things. Small things at first. A snare trap, cleverly hidden beside a game trail. A series of notches cut into a tree, too high to be a survey mark. Then he saw the skulls. They were hanging from the low branches of a massive ancient oak, tied with strips of rawhide. There were 3 of them. Coyotes, maybe. Or wolves. They'd been picked clean by birds and bleached white by the sun. They twisted slowly in the breeze, empty eye sockets staring out at the silent woods. Eli slowed his pace, his stomach twisting into a cold knot. It was another one of Thorne's markers, a sign that they were still in his territory. He looked ahead at Jonas. The hunter had seen the skulls. He had to have. But he hadn't broken stride. He hadn't even glanced at them. He just kept walking, whistling that same soft, off-key tune he'd been whistling when he found them in the cave. Chapter 13. This is it. Jonas Blackwood didn't shout. He didn't have to. The 2 words, spoken in his low gravel, cut through the pines and hung in the air like smoke. He'd led them for another 2 hours, a relentless, silent march that had pushed Eli's fever-weakened body to its limit. They came over a final rise, and there it was. The homestead wasn't much. Just a small, solid-looking cabin built of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and stone. A thin curl of smoke rose from a fieldstone chimney, a gray ribbon against the deep blue of the afternoon sky. It sat in a clearing that had been carved out of the forest with an axe and a stubborn will, a small patch of civilization in a world of green and granite. It was the first real building they had seen since the train. It should have looked like a sanctuary. To Eli, it looked like a trap. As they approached, the cabin door creaked open. A woman stepped out onto the narrow porch. She was younger than Jonas, with long dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and a face that might have been beautiful once. Now it was just hollow. Her eyes were large and dark, and they seemed to look right through them, focusing on something far away that only she could see. She held a wooden spoon in one hand like a weapon, her knuckles white. "Jonas," she said, her voice a whisper, barely carrying across the clearing. "You're back." "Brought company," Jonas said. He stopped a few yards from the porch, gesturing to the 3 of them with his rifle. They were making a racket up on the north ridge. "Found him before Kelligan's boys or Oates did." The woman's eyes drifted over them, but there was no curiosity in her gaze. No pity. No welcome. It was the look a person gives a line of clouds on the horizon. Something that is there, but has nothing to do with you. When Jonas said the name Oates, she flinched, a small, barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. "They're children," she whispered. "They're hungry," Jonas corrected. "And this one's sick." He nodded at Eli. "Get some stew in him. I'm going to check my snares before dark." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the trees as silently as he had appeared, leaving them alone with the hollow-eyed woman. She stood on the porch for a long moment, just staring. Eli could feel Milo tense beside him, ready to bolt. Clara stood her ground, her hand never far from the knife at her belt, her expression a mask of cold defiance. Finally, the woman spoke. "The stew is on. Come inside. Before the cold gets in." She turned and went back into the cabin, leaving the door open. It was an invitation, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like an order. Clara made the decision. She gave a short, sharp nod, and they walked up the 3 wooden steps and into the cabin. The inside was one room, clean and spare. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a black pot bubbling over a low flame, filling the small space with the rich smell of venison and root vegetables. A rough-hewn table with 2 benches stood in the center of the room. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, was tucked into a corner. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars of preserves, sacks of flour and beans, and neatly stacked firewood. It was a place of order, of preparation. A fortress built against hunger and the wilderness. But it was quiet. The silence was the first thing Eli noticed. It was a dead, heavy quiet, a silence that felt older and deeper than the woods outside. There were no children's toys on the floor, no scuff marks on the walls, no clutter of a life being lived. It was as clean and impersonal as a room for rent. The woman, who Eli guessed was Miriam, Jonas's wife, moved around the room without a sound. She ladled thick, dark stew into 5 earthenware bowls, her movements graceful but hesitant, as if she were afraid of making too much noise. She flinched when Milo accidentally scraped a bench against the floorboards, a sharp, indrawn breath. They sat at the table, the 3 of them on one bench, facing the empty space on the other. Miriam placed the bowls in front of them. She didn't sit. She stood by the fireplace, her back to them, stirring the pot with the wooden spoon. They ate like wolves. The stew was hot and rich, thick with meat and potatoes and wild onions. It was the first real food they'd had in days, and it was a fire in their bellies, chasing away the cold and some of the fear. Eli ate until his stomach hurt, until the world stopped feeling quite so gray and shaky. He was halfway through his bowl when he noticed it. Miriam had set 5 places. 3 bowls for them. 1 on the other side of the table, presumably for Jonas when he returned. And a 5th. At the head of the table, where the man of the house would sit. A bowl, a spoon, and a tin cup, set neatly on the worn wood. The chair was empty. Eli looked at Clara, then at Milo. They hadn't noticed. They were too focused on the food. He looked at Miriam's back. She was still stirring the pot, her shoulders hunched. The silence in the room stretched, pulled taut. All Eli could hear was the sound of their spoons scraping against the bowls and the soft bubble of the stew. The quiet was starting to feel loud, like a scream held just behind the teeth. He had to break it. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice sounding rough in the stillness. Miriam didn't turn, but her stirring slowed. Are we expecting someone else?" Eli asked, nodding toward the empty place setting. The spoon in Miriam's hand stopped moving. She stood frozen for a 5 count, her back ramrod straight. The silence in the cabin was absolute now. Even the fire seemed to have gone quiet. When she finally turned, her face was a pale blank mask. Her dark, hollow eyes weren't looking at Eli. They were fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table. A flicker of something moved in their depths, pain or memory or madness. It was impossible to tell. She opened her mouth, and when she spoke, her voice was a dry whisper, a rustle of dead leaves. "Old habits," she said to the empty chair. Then she turned back to the fire and began to stir the stew again, her movements slow and measured, as if she had forgotten they were even there. Chapter 14. You don't snore. Eli opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the rough-hewn log ceiling of the cabin, dark and solid above him. The second was Miriam, standing over the pallet where he'd slept, holding a tin cup of water. Her face was as pale and unreadable in the gray morning light as it had been the night before. "The other one did," she said, her voice a flat morning whisper. "A boy named Thomas. Snored like a saw going through wet pine. Jonas made him sleep in the lean-to." She held out the cup. "Drink." Eli pushed himself up on his elbows. The fever had broken. The fire in his veins had been replaced by a deep aching weakness, but his head was clear. He took the cup and drank. The water was cold and clean. Across the room, Clara was already awake, sitting on the bench with her back to the wall, watching Miriam with the unblinking intensity of a hawk. Milo was still a lump under a wool blanket, trying to pretend the world didn't exist. The cabin was quiet, filled with the smell of wood smoke and bacon. A skillet sizzled on the hearth. "Jonas is gone," Miriam said, as if reading his mind. She took the empty cup from him. "Went out before sunrise." Checking his lines. She went back to the fire, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. The piece was a thin sheet of ice over deep cold water. They ate bacon and hard biscuits in near silence, Miriam moving around them like a ghost. She'd talk, but never to them. She'd pick up a stray piece of kindling and murmur, "Sarah was good at stacking the wood." Small hands. She'd wipe down the table and say, "Joseph always spilled his milk." It was like they were living in a house full of dead children, and Miriam was the only one who could still see them. Where did they go? Milo finally asked, his voice small. He couldn't take the quiet, the constant one-sided conversations with the past. The other children. Thomas and Sarah and Joseph. Miriam stopped her sweeping, her back to them. For a long moment she didn't move. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Not hollow. Brittle. Like a dead leaf. "They went away," she said. "This is a hard place. It asks for a lot. Some children, they aren't strong enough to pay. So they find another place. A quieter place." She resumed her sweeping, the rhythmic scrape of the broom against the wood the only sound. Clara's eyes met Eli's across the table. A quieter place. Like a grave. The day crawled by. The silence in the cabin was a weight. Clara sat on the porch, sharpening her knife on a whetstone she'd found, her eyes scanning the tree line. Milo tried to make himself useful, stacking firewood, but his hands shook so much he kept dropping the logs. He finally gave up, and huddled by the fire, staring into the flames. Eli felt a restless energy. He was too weak to help, too keyed up to sit still. The cabin felt like a cage, and Miriam was their silent, unpredictable warden. He watched her move through her chores, a creature of pure habit. She mended one of Jonas's shirts, her stitches small and perfect. She kneaded dough for the evening's bread, her movements automatic. But her eyes were always somewhere else. That's when he saw the door. It was in the back corner of the cabin, half hidden by a hanging bearskin. It wasn't a proper door, just a few rough planks nailed together with a leather pole for a handle. It was the only part of the cabin he hadn't seen. Curiosity was a dangerous thing. Eli knew that. It was what got you noticed at St. Augustine's. It was what got you put on a train heading west. But the silence in this house was a question that needed an answer, and he had a feeling the answer was behind that door. He waited until Miriam went outside to the well for water. Clara was still on the porch, her back to the door. Milo was asleep by the fire. He moved as quietly as he could, his bare feet making no sound. He lifted the edge of the heavy bearskin. The air behind it was cold, still. He pulled the leather latch. The door opened with a low groan of protest. He slipped inside and pulled it shut behind him. He was in a small, windowless room. It was a child's bedroom. A small cot was pushed against one wall, a single thin pillow at its head. A three-legged stool stood beside it, and on the floor was a small wooden rocking horse, its paint faded and worn. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wool, and something else, something faint and sad like dried flowers. A thick layer of gray dust coated everything, a soft blanket over a dead world. But it wasn't undisturbed. Eli knelt, his fingers tracing a line in the dust on the floor. A set of footprints. Small bare feet. They led from the door to the cot and back again. And the quilt on the cot, though dusty, was turned down, as if someone had just gotten out of bed. Someone came in here. He moved deeper into the room, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He felt like a grave robber. This was a private place. A place of mourning. On the stool beside the bed sat a small wooden music box. It was intricately carved, with a scene of deer and trees on the lid. He reached out, his fingers hesitating just above the wood. He didn't want to touch it. He felt like if he did, the silence would break, and the grief that filled this room would come pouring out like a flood. He noticed the floorboards then. Near the cot, the dust was scuffed away. There were marks in the wood, the kind of scrapes and gouges a small boy would make playing with a toy soldier or a pocket knife. But one set of marks was different. A name, carved into the floor with the tip of a nail, the letters shaky and uncertain. Samuel. A floorboard creaked in the main room. Eli froze. Miriam. She was back from the well. He heard the clunk of the water bucket being set down by the hearth. He was trapped. He looked around the small room, his eyes wide with panic. There was nowhere to go. The cot was too low to the ground to hide under. The only other piece of furniture was a small, narrow wardrobe standing in the corner. He heard her footsteps, soft and hesitant, approaching the bearskin. He scrambled for the wardrobe, pulled the door open and squeezed inside, pulling it shut just as the door to the bedroom groaned open. He held his breath, praying the old wood wouldn't betray him. He was crammed in a space that smelled of cedar and mothballs, his cheek pressed against a rough wool coat. Through a crack in the wardrobe door, he could see her. Miriam stepped into the room. She moved to the cot and stood over it, looking down at the empty space where a child should have been. Her face was a blank mask of sorrow. She reached out and smoothed the quilt, a gesture of pure, heartbreaking habit. Then she went to the stool and picked up the music box. She held it in both hands, her thumbs stroking the carved wood. She didn't open it. She didn't wind it. She just held it, her eyes closed, as if she could absorb some memory, some echo from the cold, silent object. She stood like that for a full minute. A statue of grief. Then from outside came the sound of a man's heavy tread on the porch steps. Jonas. Miriam's eyes snapped open. The spell was broken. She carefully placed the music box back on the stool, turned, and walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. Eli stayed hidden in the wardrobe, his heart pounding. He waited, listening to the muffled sounds from the main room. Jonas's low voice, Miriam's whispered reply. The sound of a heavy pack being dropped on the floor. He was about to risk opening the door when he heard Jonas's footsteps approaching. They stopped right outside the bedroom. Did you talk to them? Jonas's voice was a low rumble right on the other side of the door. A little, Miriam whispered. What about the sick one? He's better. The fever is gone. There was a long pause. Eli could hear the crackle of the fire, the wind sighing around the corners of the cabin. Then Jonas spoke again, his voice so low Eli had to strain to hear it. He has the boy's eyes. Eli's blood went cold. Don't say that, Jonas. Miriam's voice was sharp with pain. It's true, Jonas said. Same color. Same look. Like he's seeing things the rest of us can't. Another silence. Eli held his breath until his lungs burned. The debt has to be paid, Miriam, Jonas said, his voice flat, hard. Oates is waiting. He'll want a trade. He always wants a trade. The leather latch on the bedroom door clicked. Jonas's hand reached for the doorknob of the wardrobe. Chapter 15. Step out. Jonas's voice was flat. A command, not a request. The wardrobe door swung open, and Eli stumbled out of the darkness, blinking in the dim light of the child's room. He was still crammed with the smell of cedar and old wool. Jonas Blackwood stood there, his rifle held loose in one hand, his pale eyes missing nothing. He looked from Eli to the dusty cot, then to the small carved name on the floor. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, like a man who'd seen this all before. Curiosity is a hungry animal, Jonas said, his voice a low rumble. Feed it too much, it gets bold. Starts thinking it owns the place. He gestured with the rifle barrel toward the main room. Go on. Your friends are waiting. Eli walked past him, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't dare look at Miriam, who stood by the hearth like a statue, her face a blank wall. Clara and Milo were at the table, a fresh pot of coffee steaming between them. They looked up as he entered, their faces a mixture of relief and fear. Clara's hand was on her knife. Milo just looked sick. "The boy was exploring," Jonas said, following Eli into the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in it was enough. "Found a room that ain't his concern." He set his rifle down on the table, the heavy wood making a solid thud that made them all jump. "There are 2 rules in this house. You eat what's put in front of you. And you don't go where you're not invited. You understand me?" Eli nodded, his throat too dry to speak. "Good," Jonas said. He pulled a chair from the table and sat, pouring himself a cup of the black coffee. "Because Oates is a patient man. But I'm not." The next 2 days were a quiet kind of hell. They were prisoners. Jonas didn't lock them in, didn't tie them up. He didn't need to. The woods were a better cage than any man could build. And he was always there. Or Miriam was. They were never left alone. They ate well. Venison stew, fresh bread, strong coffee. Eli's strength returned, the last of the fever washed out of him by Miriam's bitter teas and the sheer force of his own will to survive. But the food tasted of ashes. Every meal felt like they were being fattened for slaughter. Jonas would disappear for hours, his rifle on his shoulder, and return with a rabbit or a brace of grouse. He never said where he was going. He never said what he was doing. But Eli knew. He was checking the woods. He was waiting. For Oates. For the trade. Miriam was the true jailer. She was always there, moving through the cabin with her silent, ghostly grace. She'd mend their torn clothes, her stitches small and neat. She'd make sure they had water. But she never spoke to them. She only spoke to the ghosts of the children who had been there before. Her whispers filled the quiet spaces, a constant, unnerving reminder that they were just the latest in a long line of lost things that had found their way to this cabin. On the 3rd day, Jonas went out early before the sun was fully up. "Gotta check the long lines up on the ridge," he'd said. "Be back by nightfall." It was their chance. Eli knew it. Clara knew it too. He could see it in the way she watched the tree line from the porch, her body coiled like a spring. But Miriam was there. She was sitting on the porch steps, polishing a set of silver spoons that looked ancient and out of place in this rough world. She wasn't watching them, not directly, but she was a barrier, a silent, fragile wall between them and the woods. "We could just run," Milo whispered. He was pacing back and forth in the cabin, a caged animal. "Just push past her and run." "And go where?" Clara said, her voice sharp. "Into his woods. He knows every trail. He'd track us down before we made a mile. We need a plan. We need to know what we're up against." Eli's mind kept going back to the conversation he'd overheard. The debt has to be paid. Oates is waiting. He'll want a trade. What was the debt? And what was the trade? He thought of the child's room, the name carved in the floor. Samuel. He had to get out of the cabin. He had to see what was out there. He waited until mid-afternoon. Miriam had gone to the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, her back to the house, as she pulled weeds with a slow, methodical rhythm. Clara was dozing on the porch, worn out from the constant vigilance. Milo was inside, trying to carve a piece of wood into something that looked vaguely like a bird. Eli slipped out the back door. It was a risk. A stupid one. But staying put felt worse. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. He moved quickly, keeping the cabin between him and Miriam. The woods started just a few yards from the back of the house, a solid wall of green. He was about to plunge into them when he saw it. A narrow path, almost hidden by overgrown ferns, led away from the cabin, deeper into a grove of aspens. It wasn't a game trail, It had been made by human feet. He followed it. The path wound for 100 yards through the silent white-barked trees before opening into another clearing, smaller and more secluded than the one the cabin sat in. And in the center of the clearing was a grave. It was small, a child's grave. A simple weathered wooden cross was stuck in the mound of earth. The name that had been carved into it was almost gone, worn away by years of sun and snow. He could make out an S and maybe an L at the end. Samuel. The sight of it made his breath catch in his chest. This was the quiet place Miriam had talked about. Beside the grave, half buried in the grass, was a small wooden horse. Its paint was peeling, one of its rockers broken. It was the same horse he had seen in the dusty bedroom. But it was the flowers that made his blood run cold. A small, fresh bunch of purple mountain asters had been placed at the base of the cross. They weren't wilted. They'd been picked this morning. Someone had been here. Recently. He knelt, his fingers tracing the faded letters on the cross. This was the heart of the secret. The grief that filled this place was so thick it felt like he was breathing water. This was why Jonas hunted. This was why Miriam whispered to ghosts. It all came back to this small patch of earth. He was so focused on the grave that he didn't hear her. You shouldn't be here. The voice was a whisper right behind him. Eli spun around, scrambling to his feet, his heart leaping into his throat. Miriam stood at the edge of the clearing, a bundle of weeds in her hand. Her face was no longer blank. Her hollow eyes were filled with a fierce, protective light. It was the look of a mother wolf guarding her den. Some places, she said, her voice low and trembling with an emotion he couldn't name, are meant to stay undisturbed. She took a step toward him, and for the first time Eli was truly afraid of her. She wasn't a ghost. She was something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose. Her eyes flicked past him to the grave. The fierce light softened, replaced by a wave of sorrow so profound it was a physical thing. He was so small, she whispered, more to the grave than to him. He never liked the cold. She looked back at Eli, and her eyes were hard again. Jonas will kill you if he finds you here. He thinks this place is his. His pain. His memory. He doesn't share it. What happened to him? Eli asked, his voice barely audible. Miriam's gaze drifted back to the cross. The mountain took him, she said. It takes the weak ones. The ones who can't pay the debt. She looked at Eli, and a strange cold clarity entered her eyes. It's a hungry place, this mountain. It always wants more. A branch snapped in the woods behind them. Miriam's head whipped around, her body going rigid. The fear was back in her face, sharp and immediate. He's back, she hissed. He's early. She grabbed Eli's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into his flesh like talons. Come on, she said, her voice urgent, pulling him away from the grave. He can't find you here. He can't ever know you were here. Chapter 16. He'll see your tracks. Miriam's whisper was a frantic hiss, her fingers digging into Eli's arm like claws. She dragged him through the aspens, her earlier fragility gone, replaced by the wiry, desperate strength of a cornered animal. He reads the ground like a book. He'll know. Eli stumbled after her, his mind reeling. The quiet grief of the grave, Miriam's sudden, fierce transformation, the snapping branch, it was all a blur. They burst out of the trees, just as Jonas's heavy tread sounded on the front porch. Miriam shoved Eli toward the back of the cabin. The woodpile. Get behind it. Don't make a sound. She was gone, melting back toward the vegetable patch, leaving Eli alone with the scent of pine and his own hammering heart. He scrambled behind the woodpile, a messy stack of split logs that smelled of sap and winter, and crouched down, peering through a gap in the wood. Jonas came around the side of the cabin, his rifle in one hand, a string of 3 fat squirrels in the other. He stopped, his pale eyes scanning the clearing, taking in the vegetable patch where Miriam was now calmly pulling weeds, her back to him. He looked at the back door, then at the ground. His gaze lingered for a half-second on the spot where Eli had emerged from the woods. He knew. Eli held his breath. He could feel the splinters of the logs pressing into his cheek. Jonas didn't say a word. He walked over to a stump, dropped the squirrels, and pulled the long, sharp knife from his belt. He began to skin them with a methodical, unhurried efficiency, the blade moving with a practiced grace that was terrifying to watch. The only sounds were the soft tearing of skin and the buzz of a fly. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. Eli stayed hidden until his legs cramped, until the cold of the evening began to seep into his bones. Finally, Jonas finished his work, wiped his knife on his trousers, and went inside. Eli waited another 10 minutes, counting the seconds before he dared to move. He slipped back into the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of frying meat. Jonas was at the table, cleaning his rifle. Miriam was at the hearth. No one looked at him. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. They ate dinner without a word being spoken. The squirrel was tough and stringy. Later, when the cabin was dark, except for the dull orange glow of the embers in the fireplace, Eli lay on his pallet, feigning sleep. He could hear Milo's soft, whimpering snores from the other side of the room. Clara was a still, silent shape in the darkness. He heard a floorboard creak. He opened his eyes a slit. Miriam was standing over him. In the faint light from the hearth, her face was a mask of shadows, her eyes 2 dark, bottomless pits. She held a folded quilt in her hands. She knelt beside him, the movement as silent as a falling leaf. She spread the quilt over him, her hands brushing his shoulder. Her touch was cold. "He was always cold," she whispered, her voice so low it was just a breath of sound. "Even in the summer. A chill he was born with." Eli didn't move. He didn't breathe. He was pretending to be asleep, but he could feel the intensity of her gaze on his face. "That winter was the worst," she continued, her voice a dry rustle. "The snow came early and stayed late. It buried the cabin up to the windows. A white grave. Jonas was gone, trapping up north. It was just me. And Samuel." She paused, and in the silence, Eli could hear the wind moaning around the corners of the cabin. It sounded like a woman crying. "The fever came on him fast," she said. "One day he was carving a little horse out of a piece of pine, the next he couldn't lift his head. I did everything I knew. Boiled willow bark for tea. Kept him warm. But the cold was inside him. It was eating him from the inside out." Her hand came to rest on his forehead, her fingers cool against his skin. "His skin was like fire. Just like yours was. I'd put cool cloths on his head, and they'd be steaming in a minute." She was quiet for a long time. Eli could feel the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. He thought she was finished, that she would go back to her own bed. But then she spoke again, her voice thick with a grief so raw it was a physical wound. "He died in my arms. Right here. On this floor. The sun was coming up, and the light on the snow was so bright it hurt your eyes. He just stopped breathing. He got quiet." She took a shaky breath. "I sat with him for 2 days. I couldn't put him in the cold ground. Not in the winter. He never liked the cold." Eli felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. He could picture it. A young woman, alone in a buried cabin, holding her dead son, the silence and the snow pressing in on her. "When Jonas came back he was hard," she said. "He didn't cry. He just took the boy, wrapped him in his best blanket, and carried him out to the aspens. He dug the grave himself, in the frozen ground. It took him all day. When he came back inside, he took all of Samuel's things, the cot, the horse, the little carvings, and put them in the back room. He said we would never speak his name again. She fell silent. The only sound was the crackle of the embers. "But I do," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I speak it every day. I set his place at the table. I remember the way he laughed when he saw a blue jay. It's all I have left. Jonas, he thinks you can bury a memory. But you can't. It just grows. Like a seed in the dark." Eli lay perfectly still, the weight of her story pressing down on him. This wasn't a house of ghosts. It was a house of grief. A grief so large it had broken the people who lived here, had turned them into strangers living with the memory of a dead child. "Sometimes," she said, her voice dropping even lower, becoming conspiratorial, "I still hear him. When the wind blows just right through the aspens, it sounds like his laughter. I see him, out of the corner of my eye, a flash of his red shirt by the woodpile. It's not real. I know it's not real. It's just my mind playing tricks. But it's enough." Her hand tightened on his shoulder, her grip suddenly desperately strong. She leaned closer, her face just inches from his, her breath a cool whisper against his cheek. "But you've seen him too, haven't you?" The question was a physical shock. Eli's eyes flew open. He was looking directly into her dark, intense gaze. She wasn't talking about a ghost. She was talking about something else. Something she saw in him. "You have his eyes," she whispered, her voice trembling, on the edge of breaking. "The boy with the hollow eyes. The look he had at the end. When he knew he was leaving. I see it in you." Her face was a mask of desperate, pleading hope. She wasn't asking if he'd seen a spirit. She was asking if he understood her pain. If he, another lost boy who had looked death in the face, could see the same ghost she did. A shadow fell over them. Jonas stood at the foot of the pallet, a black, silent shape against the dying glow of the fire. He held his rifle in one hand. He said nothing. But his pale eyes, gleaming in the darkness, were fixed on his wife's hand, clutching Eli's shoulder. Chapter 17. "Get off the boy, Miriam." Jonas's voice was a low, flat stone, dropped into the deep well of the cabin's silence. He didn't move from the foot of the pallet. He didn't raise his rifle. He just spoke, and the two words had the force of a backhand slap. Miriam recoiled as if burned, snatching her hand back from Eli's shoulder. She scrambled to her feet, a flurry of shadows and fear, and retreated to the hearth, melting back into her own world of grief. She didn't look back. Jonas's pale eyes stayed on Eli for a 3 count, a cold, appraising look that stripped him bare. Then he turned, leaned his rifle against the wall, and added a log to the fire. The moment was over. The threat had passed, leaving the air thick and sour with unspoken things. Sleep didn't come. Eli lay on his pallet, staring into the darkness, his mind a hornet's nest of fear. He wasn't afraid of Oates anymore. He was afraid of the man sleeping 10 feet away. He was afraid of the woman who saw a ghost in his eyes. He was afraid of the quiet, suffocating grief that filled this cabin like a poison gas. He must have drifted off, because he was suddenly back at St. Augustine's, the smell of carbolic acid and boiled cabbage thick in his throat. He was a child again, small and thin, hiding under his cot as Brother Morris's heavy boots walked down the aisle, the leather strap swinging a pendulum of casual cruelty. "The weak ones get taken," a voice whispered in his ear. "The mountain is always hungry." He woke with a gasp, the wool blanket tangled around his legs, his skin slick with a cold sweat. The cabin was gray with the first hint of dawn. Jonas was already gone. Breakfast was a tense, silent affair. Miriam placed a skillet of fried salt pork and 3 hard biscuits on the table, and retreated to the fireplace. She hadn't looked at Eli once. Milo picked at his biscuit, his eyes darting around the room. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. "He was out there again last night," he whispered, leaning across the table. "Who?" Eli asked, though he knew the answer. "Oates," Milo hissed. "I saw him. By the trees. Just standing there. Watching." Clara put her biscuit down with a sharp click. "You saw a shadow, Milo. You're spooked." "It wasn't a shadow," he insisted, his voice rising. "It was him. And the grave. I looked out this morning. The ground is all dug up. Like something was trying to get out." "Stop it," Clara said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're letting this place get in your head. There are no ghosts. There's just a crazy man in the woods, and a hunter who's got us in a cage. That's real. Focus on what's real." "The disturbed ground is real," Milo shot back. Before the argument could catch fire, the cabin door swung open. Jonas stood there, his rifle on his shoulder. He looked at the three of them, his pale eyes lingering on Eli. "You," he said, pointing at Eli with his chin. "You're coming with me." "Where?" Eli asked, his stomach tightening. "You ate my meat. You're sleeping under my roof. You're gonna learn how to earn it." He turned and walked out. It wasn't an invitation. Eli looked at Clara. Her face was a mask, but he saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "Stay close," she mouthed. He followed Jonas into the woods. The hunter moved with a silent, relentless pace, and Eli had to half-jog to keep up. He didn't speak, just pushed through the trees with a grim purpose. After a mile, he stopped at a small clearing. A snare trap, one Eli had noticed on their way in, had been sprung. A rabbit was caught in the wire loop, its neck broken. Jonas knelt beside it. "You know how to clean one of these?" "No," Eli said. "Time you learned." Jonas pulled his long, sharp knife from its sheath. "The wild provides. But it don't give nothing for free. It's a trade. A life for a life." He made a quick, expert cut, and began to skin the rabbit. "You gotta be quick. You gotta be clean. No wasted moves. The woods don't like waste." He worked in silence for a few minutes, his hands moving with a practiced bloody grace. "This place, it has a balance," he said, not looking up from his work. "You take something, you gotta give something. That's the oldest rule." He paused, wiping the blade on a handful of leaves. "Miriam, she don't understand that. She thinks you can just keep a thing. Hold on to it. But you can't. The mountain always collects its debts." He looked up then, his pale eyes pinning Eli to the spot. "She likes you. Thinks you got a good soul." He went back to his work. "Oates, he likes 'em with good souls. Thinks they taste better." The casual brutality of the words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a lesson in survival. This was a threat. "What do you want from us?" Eli asked, his voice shaking slightly. Jonas finished with the rabbit and stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Want?" He let out a short, harsh laugh. "I don't want nothing. I'm a hunter. I provide. For my wife. For the mountain. For the things that are hungry." He looked Eli up and down, a butcher, appraising a side of beef. "You're weak. But you're a survivor. I'll give you that. You might be worth something." He started walking again, leaving Eli to follow, his mind racing. A trade. Jonas was going to trade them to Oates. Maybe not all of them. Maybe just the weak one. The one with the good soul. He spent the rest of the day in a state of cold dread. Jonas showed him how to track, how to read the signs the animals left behind. He showed him which plants would kill you and which would keep you alive. It was a dark, brutal education, and every lesson felt like a test. A test to see if he was worth keeping. They got back to the cabin as the sun was setting. Milo was on the porch, his face pale, his eyes wide with a new terror. "It's gone," he whispered as soon as they were in earshot. "What's gone?" Jonas asked, his voice flat. "The horse," Milo said, pointing a trembling finger toward the woods. "The little wooden horse. From the grave. I went to look. To see if the ground was really dug up. It was. And the horse is gone." Jonas's face hardened. He strode past them into the aspens. Eli, Clara, and Milo followed. The clearing was just as Eli remembered it, but Milo was right. The earth on the small grave looked wrong. It was churned up, disturbed, as if a dog had been digging at it. And the small broken rocking horse was gone. Jonas stared at the grave, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. A low guttural sound came from his throat, a growl of pure animal rage. This was a desecration. A violation of his private, sacred pain. He spun around, his pale eyes blazing. He wasn't looking at Eli. He was looking at Milo. "You," he snarled. "You did this." "No," Milo stammered, backing away. "I didn't. I swear." "Liar," Jonas said, taking a step toward him. "You've been spooked since you got here. Whispering about ghosts. You did this to mock me. To mock him." "It was Oates," Milo cried, his voice breaking. "He's playing with us. He took it." "Oates don't come here," Jonas said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "This place is mine." He lunged for Milo. But Clara was faster. She moved between them, her small knife in her hand. "Leave him alone." Jonas stopped, looking down at her as if she were an annoying insect. He could have broken her in two. But he just stared, his chest heaving. Eli's eyes were on the ground. He saw the tracks then. Their own tracks leading into the clearing. And another set. Fainter. A small, barefoot track leading from the grave into the deep woods. It looked like a child's. A trick of the light, maybe. Or maybe not. He woke in the middle of the night to a floorboard creaking. The cabin was pitch black. He lay still, listening. He heard the soft whisper of the door being opened, then closed. He waited a full minute, his heart pounding, before he slipped out of his blanket. He crept to the door and peered out. The moon was high, bathing the clearing in a cold silver light. The clearing was empty. He went back inside and moved silently to Milo's pallet. It was empty. The blanket was thrown back. Milo was gone. Eli's eyes scanned the room. Jonas and Miriam were still in their bed. Clara was a still shape on her pallet. He looked down at the floor by Milo's empty bed. In the faint moonlight filtering through the single window, he could see them clearly. A set of muddy footprints leading from Milo's pallet to the cabin door. Chapter 18. The muddy footprints were a question mark scrawled on the floorboards in the dark. Eli stared at them, the cold of the wood seeping into his bare feet. One set. Leading from Milo's empty pallet to the door. And no tracks leading back. He didn't make a sound. He moved across the room, a shadow among shadows, and touched Clara's shoulder. She came awake instantly, not with a gasp, but with a sudden coiled stillness. Her hand was already on her knife. Eli pointed toward the empty pallet, then to the door. Her eyes followed his, and in the faint moonlight he saw her face harden into a mask of cold understanding. The floorboard under the main bed groaned. Jonas was awake. Or he'd never been asleep. "Looking for your friend." His voice came out of the darkness, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. There was no surprise in it. No concern. Just a flat, dead certainty. He's gone. Clara was on her feet, the knife held low at her side. "Where is he?" "Ran," Jonas said. He sat up, a large, dark shape detaching itself from the shadows of the bed. Miriam was a smaller, stiller shape beside him. The boy was spooked. Had bad dreams. He took a biscuit and a canteen and lit out before moonset. Headed east. He won't last 2 days. Liar, Clara hissed. Jonas swung his legs out of bed. He was just wearing his long johns, but he seemed more dangerous, more elemental than he did fully clothed. You think I killed him? For what? A half-starved city rat. He wasn't worth the bullet. He stood up, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He was a debt the mountain was going to collect sooner or later. He just decided to pay it early. The footprints, Eli said, his voice quiet but clear in the tense silence. They're muddy. The ground outside is dry. Jonas looked down at the tracks, then back at Eli. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even respect, passed through his pale eyes. The water bucket. He knocked it over on his way out. He shrugged. Boy was clumsy. Panicked. It was a good answer. A simple one. And Eli didn't believe it for a second. We're leaving, Clara said. It wasn't a request. She moved toward the door, grabbing her worn-out pack. No, Jonas said. The word was soft, but it stopped her cold. You ain't going nowhere. Not till I say so. You can't keep us here, she said, her hand tightening on the knife. I can, Jonas said. This is my land. My rules. You're here because I let you be here. You'll leave when I let you leave. He walked to the hearth and stirred the embers, bringing a dull orange glow to life. It cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the small cabin into a cage. You want to know what's out there? You want to know what you're really running from? He looked at them, his face half in shadow, half in the dying firelight. You think Oates is the only monster in these woods? You think Kelligan is the only man who trades in flesh? He let out a short, harsh laugh. You're children. You don't know nothing. He went to a large, locked chest in the corner of the room, one Eli had assumed held blankets or winter clothes. He pulled a key from a nail above the fireplace and unlocked it. The lid opened with a low groan. You want to see who I am, he said, his back to them. You want to know what a real debt looks like? He reached inside and began to pull things out, placing them on the table one by one. It wasn't a collection of souls. It was a collection of endings. The first thing he placed on the table was a wanted poster, creased and stained, for a man named Black-Eyed Jedediah Kane. Wanted for train robbery. Reward, $500. Next to it, he placed a single ornate silver spur. He pulled out a worn leather Bible, a bullet hole punched clean through the front cover. Then a cavalry medal for valor, its ribbon frayed and stained dark rusty brown. A pair of gambler's dice, carved from bone. A lady's hand mirror, its silver back tarnished, the glass cracked. It was a museum of dead men's lives. The last thing they'd held, the one thing that mattered. Before Miriam, before Samuel, I had a trade, Jonas said, his voice a low monotone as he arranged the items. I was a hunter, but not of animals. He looked up at them, his pale eyes gleaming in the firelight. They called us regulators back then. Retrieval agents. Bounty hunters. We tracked men. Army deserters, escaped slaves, outlaws with a price on their heads. Men who had run out of road. He picked up the silver spur. Jedediah Kane. Tracked him for 3 weeks, all the way to the Mexican border. He thought he was home free. He was cleaning his boots when I found him. This was on his heel. He picked up the Bible. Preacher Sims. Killed a man over a card game in Dodge. Said God told him to. I found him in a soddy in Nebraska, praying for forgiveness. He was holding this when he died. He was a collector. Not of bounties, not of money. He was a collector of last moments. Every man leaves something behind, he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming almost hypnotic. A story. A debt. I was the one who came to collect. To close the book. He looked at them, and for the first time, Eli saw something other than coldness in his eyes. He saw a deep, profound loneliness. I took a piece of them. A reminder. So they wouldn't be forgotten. So their story wouldn't just blow away on the wind. He called it collecting souls. And in a way, it was. He was the grim archivist of the violent, desperate men he'd been paid to hunt. Clara was staring at the table, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped her knife. She was looking at the last item Jonas had placed on the rough-hewn wood. It was a locket. A small silver heart, tarnished with age on a delicate chain. It was the kind of cheap trinket a young girl might save for months to buy. "Where did you get that?" Clara's voice was a choked whisper. Jonas followed her gaze. He picked up the locket, letting it swing from his thick fingers. This one was different. Not a man. A girl. Part of a shipment Kelligan was bringing in for the Blackrock mines a couple years back. The whole lot of 'em tried to run. The company paid me to track 'em down. A private contract. He looked at the locket, a flicker of memory in his eyes. She was fast. Smart. Almost made it over the ridge. She was holding this when I found her. Cried when I took it. Said it was her mother's. Clara took a step toward the table. Her face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Eli had never seen her look so vulnerable. "What was her name?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Jonas shrugged. "Don't know. They didn't have names. Just numbers. She was number 12. Clara let out a sound, a sharp, broken gasp of pain. She reached out a shaking hand and pointed at the locket. "Her name," she said, her voice cracking, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her dirt-streaked face, "was Anna." Chapter 19. Her name was Anna. The words hung in the air, fragile as smoke. Clara's tears had stopped. Her face, in the flickering glow of the embers, was a mask of grief so profound it looked like stone. She was staring at the small silver locket in Jonas's hand, at the final brutal punctuation mark on her friend's life. Jonas looked from the locket to her face, his expression unchanged. There was no pity in his pale eyes. No remorse. Just the flat, weary disinterest of a man looking at a tool that had broken. "Anna," he repeated, the name a foreign sound in his mouth. "Don't matter. The debt was paid." He dropped the locket back onto the table, where it landed with a soft, metallic clink among the other dead men's things. That sound, that small final sound, was what broke her. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She moved. She launched herself across the table, a blur of motion and fury, the skinning knife in her hand. It wasn't a wild swing. It was a low, vicious practice thrust, aimed straight at Jonas's gut. He was faster. He wasn't a young man, but he moved with the brutal economy of a lifetime of violence. He didn't try to block the knife. He simply shifted his weight, letting the blade slice through the fabric of his shirt, scraping a red line across his ribs. At the same time, his other hand came up and caught her wrist, his thick fingers wrapping around it like a vice. The knife clattered to the floor. He held her there, her arm twisted at an unnatural angle, her face inches from his. He wasn't even breathing hard. "That was stupid," he said, his voice a low conversational growl. "That was a debt you can't afford to pay." "I'll kill you," she hissed, her voice raw with hate, her body trembling with a rage that was too big for her small frame. "Maybe," Jonas said. "Lots have tried." He looked past her, at Eli, who stood frozen by the hearth. "But not tonight." He shoved her away from him. She stumbled back, crashing into a bench, and fell to the floor in a heap. She didn't get up. She just knelt there, all the fight gone out of her, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The hard shell she'd built around herself, The one that had gotten her through the mines and the wilderness had finally cracked. Jonas looked down at the red line on his side, a thin welling of blood. He touched it with his fingertips, looked at the blood, and then looked at Eli. "See what happens," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You bring the wild inside. It makes a mess of things." He went to the cabin door and pulled it open, letting the cold night air rush in. "Get up," he said to Clara. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out into the darkness. She didn't move. "I said, get up," he repeated, his voice hardening. Eli went to her, helped her to her feet. She was limp, all the strength gone out of her. He half carried her to the door. "You want to see where the stories end?" Jonas said, stepping out onto the porch. "You want to see my trophies? Come on. I'll show you." He grabbed a lantern from a hook on the porch, lit the wick, and started walking. Not toward the path. Not toward the aspens where Samuel's grave lay. He walked straight out, into the dark, untamed woods behind the cabin. Eli looked back at the warm, firelit cabin. It had been a prison, but it was a known thing. Out here in the dark with this man, this was something else. But Clara was moving, a sleepwalker stumbling after Jonas, drawn by a grief that was stronger than her fear. Eli had no choice but to follow. The lantern cast a small, bobbing circle of yellow light, pushing back the darkness a few feet at a time. The woods were a wall of black, full of unseen things. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig was a threat. Jonas led them to a part of the woods they hadn't seen, a section of old-growth pines, their massive trunks like the pillars of a cathedral. He stopped in a small, natural clearing. The ground here was soft with years of fallen needles. "Every hunter needs a place for his trophies," Jonas said, raising the lantern. In the wavering light, Eli saw them. Graves. They were scattered throughout the clearing, marked not with crosses but with stones. Simple, uncarved field stones, pulled from the earth and set at the head of each mound. There were dozens of them. Some were old, the stones covered in moss, the mounds sunken and barely visible. Others were disturbingly recent, the earth still dark and freshly turned. This wasn't a family plot. This was a boneyard. "These are the ones who ran," Jonas said, his voice a low monotone. He walked to one of the older graves. This one was a deserter. From the fort up north. Thought he could make it to Canada. He was wrong. He kicked at the stone with his boot. Left his medal behind. He moved to another. This one was a thief. Stole a horse in Denver. A good horse. The man who owned it paid me well. He pointed with the lantern to a newer grave, the mound still high. This one was Kelligan's. A boy who got clever. Tried to steal a share of the take from the train job. Kelligan don't like clever boys. He was giving them a tour of his life's work. Each stone was a story, a debt collected, a life ended. This was his ledger, written in earth and bone. Clara had stopped crying. She was staring at the graves, her face a pale, numb mask in the lantern light. She walked slowly to one of the newer mounds, one that was smaller than the others. There was no stone, just a pile of disturbed earth. "Hannah," she whispered. Jonas shook his head. "No. I told you. The company takes them back. Dead or alive. Their property." He looked at the small, unmarked grave. That one was different. A runaway from a settlement down south. Just a boy. He was sick. Coughed up his lungs before I could even take him back. A waste. He walked to the edge of the clearing and held the lantern high, pointing it at a line of 3 fresh graves set apart from the others. The earth was dark, the mounds sharp. "These are from the train," he said. "The ones who scattered when you 3 ran. They didn't get far." Eli felt a wave of nausea. The children from the train. The ones he'd hoped had made it. They had ended up here, trophies in a madman's collection. "You're a monster," Clara said, her voice flat, dead. "I'm a hunter," Jonas corrected her. "I do a job. I collect what's owed." He turned, his pale eyes finding them in the dark. "This land is hard. It demands a price. You, the girl from the mines. You, the boy with the ghost in his eyes. You understand that. But your friend, the city rat, he didn't." He lowered the lantern, and the circle of light fell on one of the fresh mounds of earth. It was smaller than the other two. "He thought he could run," Jonas said. "He thought he could get away without paying. But you can't run from the mountain. It always gets its due." Eli stared at the small, fresh grave. The muddy footprints. The knocked-over water bucket. It was all a lie. "Where is he?" Eli asked, his voice a choked whisper. "Where's Milo?" Jonas looked at the grave, then back at Eli. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards. "He's not here," Jonas said. "I told you. He was a special case." He turned and pointed with the lantern, away from the boneyard, deeper into the dark woods. "He was making too much noise," Jonas said, his voice casual, as if he were talking about the weather. "So I put him somewhere quiet. The old root cellar. Under the ground." Chapter 20. What root cellar? Clara's voice was a blade in the dark, cutting through the heavy silence of the boneyard. All the grief, all the tears, had been burned away, leaving behind something cold and hard and dangerous. She had picked up her knife from where Jonas had knocked it from her hand, back at the cabin. She was holding it now, the lantern light glinting on the edge. Jonas Blackwood looked at the knife, then at her face, and let out a low chuckle. It was a dry, ugly sound. The old one. From the first homestead. Before this one. He gestured with the lantern, back toward the cabin. "The family that was here before me. They didn't last the winter. The cellar's still there, though. Good and deep. Keeps the meat cool in the summer, and keeps things from freezing in the winter." He looked directly at Eli. "Keeps things quiet, too." The threat was as clear as the moonlight on the fieldstones. Milo was a hostage. "You take us to him," Clara said, her voice low and steady. "Right now." "I don't think so," Jonas said. He turned and started walking back toward the cabin, the lantern swinging at his side, casting long, dancing shadows. "We got an early morning. Oates is coming. The trade is set for sunrise." He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew they would follow. They were tied to him now, by a rope of hope and fear for their friend. They walked back to the cabin, in a silence that was thick with hate. Jonas didn't seem to notice. He was a man at peace with his own, particular brand of evil. When they got back, he pointed to their pallets. "Get some sleep. You'll need it." He sat at the table, his rifle across his lap, and began to clean it, a silent, ominous sentinel in the dark. Miriam was a still, quiet shape in the bed, her face turned to the wall. Sleep was impossible. Eli lay on his pallet, his mind racing. The root cellar. Where was it? How would they get to it? Jonas was a light sleeper. Eli had learned that much. He was a predator, always half awake, always listening. He looked over at Clara. She was lying on her side, facing him, her eyes wide open in the dark, gleaming like a cat's. She was thinking the same thing. The night crawled by, each second a lifetime. The wind moaned outside. A floorboard creaked. Jonas shifted in his chair. Every sound was a threat. Just before the first hint of dawn, when the darkness is at its deepest and coldest, Jonas stood up. He added a log to the fire, then went to the door and slipped outside. To relieve himself, probably. Or to check the perimeter. It was their only chance. Clara was on her feet before he was fully out the door. She didn't make a sound. She moved to Eli's pallet and knelt, her face close to his. "The cellar has to be near the cabin," she whispered, her breath cool against his cheek. "An old one. Look for a break in the trees. A patch of ground that's too flat." "What about him?" Eli whispered back, nodding toward the door. "He won't be gone long." She pressed the skinning knife into his hand. The handle was smooth and worn. "If he finds you, don't hesitate. Go for the gut." She turned and went to the hearth, grabbing the heavy iron poker. It wasn't a rifle, but in her hands it looked just as deadly. "I'll keep him busy. You find Milo." "And then what?" "And then we run," she said. "We run till our lungs give out, and then we run some more." He didn't have time to argue. He slipped out the back door, the cold air a shock to his system. The world was a wash of gray and black, the stars just beginning to fade. He moved in a low crouch, using the woodpile for cover. He scanned the area around the cabin. He saw the vegetable patch, the path to Samuel's grave, the dense wall of the forest. Nothing looked out of place. He thought back to what Jonas had said. "The family that was here before me. There would have been another cabin. Or the beginnings of one." He looked for a foundation, a pile of old stones, anything. He found it 20 yards from the cabin, half hidden by a thicket of overgrown lilac bushes. A low mound of earth, barely visible in the gray light, with 2 heavy slanted wooden doors set into it. The root cellar. He scrambled toward it, his heart pounding. The doors were held shut by a thick wooden bar, dropped into 2 iron brackets. He tried to lift it. It was heavy, waterlogged, and swollen tight in the brackets. He grunted, pulling with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. He heard a sound from the cabin. A sharp, metallic clang. Jonas was back. Clara was keeping him busy. He looked around, frantic. He needed a lever. He saw a fallen branch, thick as his arm. He jammed it under the bar and threw all his weight on it. The wood groaned, splintered, but held. He pushed again, his muscles screaming. The bar lifted a few inches. Enough. He kicked it free of the brackets. It fell to the ground with a dull thud. He tore at the cellar doors. They were heavy, stiff with disuse. He got one open a few feet and peered into the darkness below. "Milo," he whispered. The air that came out of the cellar was cold and smelled of damp earth and rotting apples. "Milo, are you in there?" A faint sound from the darkness. A whimper. "I'm coming," Eli said. He swung his legs over the edge and dropped into the cellar. He landed on a dirt floor, his feet sinking into the soft earth. It was pitch black. The air was thick, hard to breathe. "Milo." "Eli." The voice was weak, hoarse. It came from a corner. Eli moved toward the sound, his hands outstretched. He touched a rough wooden wall, then something soft. A pile of old burlap sacks. And then, a person. He found Milo's shoulder. He was shaking violently. "Are you hurt?" "No," Milo whispered. "Just cold." "We're getting out of here," Eli said, pulling him to his feet. Milo was limp, all the fight gone out of him. A square of gray light appeared above them. Clara. She was peering down into the cellar. "Eli? Did you find him?" "I have him," he said. "He's weak." "Get him out," she said, her voice urgent. "Jonas knows. He's coming." Eli practically lifted Milo, pushing him toward the opening. "Climb," he commanded. Milo scrambled up the dirt slope, his hands finding the edge of the opening. Clara grabbed his arms and hauled him out. Eli was right behind him. He was halfway out of the cellar when he heard the shout. "Boy!" Jonas. He was at the edge of the woods, not 20 feet away. He had his rifle. But he wasn't aiming it. He was just standing there, a look of cold, murderous fury on his face. Miriam was behind him, a frantic, pleading look on hers. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Milo's arm and started running, pulling him toward the deep woods. "Eli, run!" Eli scrambled out of the cellar and took off after them. He didn't look back. He could feel Jonas's eyes on his back, a physical weight. He expected the crack of the rifle, the searing pain of the bullet. It didn't come. They plunged into the forest, the three of them together again, running for their lives. They ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, their only thought to put distance between them and the cabin. After 10 minutes of frantic, lung-bursting running, Clara pulled them to a stop. They collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air. "Did he follow us?" Milo wheezed. Eli peered back the way they had come. The woods were silent. "I don't think so." "Why didn't he shoot?" Clara wondered aloud, her voice a mix of confusion and suspicion. "He's playing with us," Eli said. "He wants us in the woods. He knows we can't get out." Clara got to her feet, her face set in a mask of grim determination. "He's wrong." She pointed to a barely visible game trail. "This way. We'll follow the creek down. It has to lead somewhere." They started walking, a desperate stumbling march. They followed the creek for what felt like miles, its cheerful burble a mocking counterpoint to their fear. The sun was up now, casting long shadows through the trees. An hour later, they came around a bend in the creek and stopped dead. In front of them, not 50 yards away, was a small, neat cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It was Jonas's cabin. They had walked in a perfect circle. Chapter 21. He knew. Milo's voice was a dead thing, a puff of air in the cold morning. He was staring at the cabin, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a picture of domestic peace that was the ugliest thing Eli had ever seen. He knew we'd end up back here. He let us run. Clara didn't say anything. She was looking at the creek, then at the trees, her eyes narrowed, reading the landscape like a book she'd just realized was written in a language she didn't understand. The grim determination on her face had been replaced by a cold, dawning horror. It wasn't the land that had beaten them. It was the man. The cabin door creaked open. Jonas Blackwood stepped out onto the porch. He held a tin cup of coffee in one hand. He didn't have his rifle. He didn't need it. He took a slow sip, his pale eyes finding them across the clearing. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man checking his trap lines and finding exactly what he expected to find. "Enjoy your walk," he called out, his voice casual, carrying easily in the still air. They didn't answer. They were caught. The woods behind them, which had seemed like a path to freedom an hour ago, now felt like the bars of a cage. "It's a clever piece of country," Jonas continued, taking another sip of coffee. "The creeks feed back on themselves. The ridges curve just so. You think you're walking a straight line east, but the land turns you, pushes you south, then west. An hour of hard walking, and you're right back where you started." He smiled, a thin, cold crack in his beard. "Took me a year to learn its secrets. Another year to improve on them." Eli understood then. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't magic. It was a trap. A meticulously crafted, patient trap made of altered game trails, false landmarks, and a deep, intimate knowledge of how a lost person's mind works. Jonas hadn't just found this prison. He had built it. "You're a smart boy," Jonas said, his eyes on Eli. "You were starting to figure it out. That's why I had to quiet your friend down. He was getting noisy. Bad for business." He finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch rail. "Now, you gonna come back on your own? Or do I have to come get you?" There was no choice. They walked back across the clearing, each step a defeat. The grass was wet with dew. The air smelled of pine and bacon grease. It was a beautiful morning to have your world end. When they stepped onto the porch, Miriam was standing in the doorway. Her face was a wreck. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild. Her hair had come loose from its braid, and she was clutching a small wooden bird, the one Milo had been carving, so tightly her knuckles were white. "You brought them back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They brought themselves back," Jonas said, stepping past her into the cabin. "Like they always do." "No," Miriam said, her voice rising, cracking with a hysteria that had been simmering for days. "No more, Jonas. Not again. Not in this house." "It's my house, Miriam," Jonas said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned to face her. "My house. My rules." "It was our house," she shrieked, and the sound was a raw, physical wound. She held up the small, half-finished wooden bird. "He was making this for Samuel. He said Samuel would have liked it." Jonas's face hardened into a mask of stone. "Don't you speak his name." "I will speak his name," she screamed, taking a step toward him. "Samuel. Samuel. Samuel. He lived here. He died here. This house is his grave, and you fill it with ghosts." She turned her wild eyes on the three of them, and for the first time Eli saw not a hollow woman, but a woman filled to the brim with a pain so vast it had drowned her. "You see," she cried, her voice a ragged sob. "This place, it never lets them leave. The trails turn back, the creek runs in circles. It's his grave, and he's lonely. Samuel needs friends to play with." She wasn't talking about a ghost. She was talking about the land itself, about the trap Jonas had built, and in her broken mind, it had all become part of her grief. The land was keeping them here because her son was buried here. It was a mad woman's logic, but in the quiet, suffocating world of the cabin, it made a terrible kind of sense. "That's enough," Jonas said, his voice a low growl. He took a step toward her. Miriam flinched back, a cornered animal. She looked from Jonas's hard face to the three children, then to the open door. And then she did the one thing none of them expected. She ran. She bolted out the door, her bare feet flying across the porch and into the clearing. She ran with a wild, desperate abandon, not toward any path, but straight into the dense, unforgiving wall of the forest. Jonas watched her go, his face unreadable. He didn't move to stop her. "Let her run," he said, his voice flat. "She'll be back in an hour. She always comes back." He turned his pale eyes on them. The moment of chaos was over. The cold, hard reality of their situation settled back over the room. "The trade is still on," he said. "Oates gets what he's owed. And I get another season of quiet." "What is the trade?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the scene they had just witnessed. Jonas walked to the fire and kicked a log into place with his boot. "It's a simple arrangement. I'm the hunter. I know these woods. Oates, he's a sickness. A ghost that won't stay buried. He gets hungry. He comes down from the high country looking for company." He looked at them, and his face was a mask of cold pragmatism. "He used to come here. To the cabin. He'd stand out there by the trees just watching. He was curious about the boy." Eli's blood went cold. "He has the boy's eyes." "So I made a deal," Jonas said. "I'm a provider. I provide for my own. I told him I'd bring him others. Strays. Runaways. The ones nobody would miss. A trade. A life for a life. He gets his company, and he stays away from my land. From Samuel's grave. He was sacrificing them. He was sacrificing other people's children to protect the memory of his own." "Kelligan's train was a gift," Jonas continued. "A bounty. More than enough to pay the debt for a year. But you three, you complicated things. You ran the wrong way. You ended up here. My problem. He walked to the door and pulled it shut with a solid final thud. He dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. They were locked in. Sunrise, he said, his back to them. Oates will be at the stone circle. He'll be waiting for his payment. He turned, and his pale eyes moved over the three of them, a butcher choosing a cut of meat. And one of you is gonna pay it. Chapter 22. The last hour of darkness was the longest. The cabin was a tinderbox of silence, waiting for a spark. Jonas sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees, a block of granite with pale, watchful eyes. He hadn't moved in hours. Clara stood by the single window, a dark silhouette against the graying square of the outside world. She held the iron poker from the hearth, its weight a grim promise in her hand. Eli was on his pallet, the skinning knife Clara had given him tucked under his blanket, its cold steel a small, hard point of reality in the swirling dread. Milo was gone. One of them was next. The sky outside began to bleed from black to a bruised purple. Sunrise. A sound cut through the morning quiet. A bird call, high and sharp, from the ridge to the north. It wasn't a real bird. It was too perfect, too piercing. It was a signal. Jonas stood up without a word. He went to the water bucket, took a long drink from the dipper, and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. He was a man, getting ready for a day's work. He picked up his rifle, then turned to face them. His eyes, flat and devoid of any emotion, moved over them one by one. He was choosing. The girls got fire, he said, his gaze settling on Clara. Oates likes that. He thinks it burns brighter. He looked at Eli. The sick one. The one with the ghost in his eyes. Oates likes them quiet. The ones who've already seen the end of things. He paused, his face a mask. Decisions. He walked to the door and lifted the heavy bar. Cold morning air, smelling of pine and damp earth, flooded the cabin. Get up. All of you. We're going for a walk. You said one, Clara said, her voice low, her knuckles white on the poker. I did, Jonas said. But the buyer likes to inspect the goods. It's his choice, not mine. I'm just the provider. He gestured with the rifle. Now, move. There was no arguing. They walked out onto the porch, into the cold, clean air of a world that didn't care they were about to die. The sun was just a red sliver on the horizon, setting the tops of the pines on fire. Jonas led them, not with the rifle in their backs, but walking a few paces ahead, as if he were taking them on a morning stroll. He knew they wouldn't run. There was nowhere to run to. He led them past the boneyard, its silent stones like crooked teeth in the gray light. He led them past the path to Samuel's grave. He led them to the circle of white stones. The air inside the circle was cold, still, and a man was waiting for them. He was standing by the largest of the quartz stones, his back to them, looking out at the rising sun. He was tall and impossibly thin, a scarecrow built of bone and old clothes. As they entered the circle, he turned, and Eli's breath caught in his throat. It was the man from his fevered dream. The man from the woods. Oates. He wasn't a ghost. He was worse. He was real. The side of his head was a ruin, a crater of scarred flesh and pale protruding bone, with splinters of dark petrified wood embedded in the mess. It wasn't a crown. It was a wound that had never healed, a permanent, gruesome trophy from the day the mountain had tried to eat him. One eye was milky white and blind, the other a sharp, intelligent black that missed nothing. One side of his mouth was pulled up in a permanent, lipless grin. He wasn't a monster from a story. He was a man who had been to hell and brought a piece of it back with him. Jonas, Oates said. His voice was a surprise. It wasn't a growl. It was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of vocal cords that had been crushed and healed wrong. Oates, Jonas replied, his voice flat. He stopped 10 feet from him. It was a meeting of kings in a dead kingdom. Got your delivery. Oates's good eye moved over them. He wasn't looking at them like people. He was looking at them like a prospector looks at a new claim, trying to judge its worth. He lingered on Clara, on the defiant fire in her eyes. He lingered on Eli, on the quiet stillness that the fever had left behind. The collector is pleased, Oates whispered, the words slithering out of his ruined mouth. Eli understood. It was a nickname. A title Jonas had given him. The collector of children. The man who filled the empty spaces in his broken mind with the ones no one else would miss. Kelligan sent a full wagon, Oates said, his eye fixing on Jonas. A bounty. The company was generous. They ran, Jonas said. These are the only 3 that came my way. The rest, the woods took 'em. The woods are hungry, Oates agreed, a flicker of something that might have been understanding in his one good eye. But the debt remains. The company promised a full share. The mountain was promised a full share. He took a slow, stiff step toward them. He moved with a slight limp, his body as broken as his face. The deal was for 1, Jonas said, his voice hardening. 1 for my quiet. 1 to keep you on your side of the ridge. The deal has changed, Oates whispered. He was closer now. Eli could smell him. He smelled of damp earth, of coal dust, and of something else, something old and sick, like meat that had been left in the dark too long. Kelligan's delivery was payment in full for the season. For all the ones who ran before. For the girl who burned my camp. His good eye settled on Clara, and a flicker of recognition of old cold hate passed through it. The debt must be paid. Tonight. He raised a hand, his fingers long and thin like a spider's legs. He pointed, not at one of them, but at all of them. You owe me 3, the collector rasped, his ruined face a mask of madness in the morning sun. And the mountain will have its due. Chapter 23. That wasn't the deal. Jonas's voice was a low, ugly thing, the sound of a rock grinding against another rock. The sun was fully up now, and in the clean morning light, the circle of stones looked like a boneyard. The deal was for 1. A payment. To keep the balance. Oates's ruined face twitched, the lipless grin widening. The balance has shifted, Hunter. His good eye, a black polished bead of hate, moved from Jonas to Clara. The company sent a full wagon. A bounty for the mountain. But the delivery was short. The debt is outstanding. They ran, Jonas repeated, his hand tightening on the stock of his rifle. That ain't my concern. It is now, Oates rasped. He took another stiff, limping step forward. You are the provider. You made a promise. To me. To the mountain. He gestured with a long, thin finger at Clara. This one burned my house. She stole my property. He pointed to Eli. This one has the quiet sickness. The kind the deep places like. He looked back at Jonas. They are all part of the same debt. Kelligan's debt. My debt. Your debt. Jonas stood his ground, a block of granite in the face of a creeping nightmare. He was a man watching a business deal go sour, and the currency was their lives. You take the girl, he said, his voice flat. She's the one you want. The fire starter. Take her and go. The boys, they're just strays. Not worth your trouble. He was selling her. Just like that. A piece of meat to be traded. Clara didn't flinch. She just stared back at Jonas, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical thing. Oates considered it, his head tilted, the gesture bird-like and unnatural. The fire starter, he whispered, his good eye fixed on Clara. Yes. She will do. For a start. He looked at Jonas. But the debt remains. 2 more are owed. Take the sick one then, Jonas said, his voice tight with a frustration that was starting to boil over into fear. He was losing control. Take them both. Leave me the last one. For later. A down payment on next season. Eli felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He was being bargained for, like a side of beef. Oates's grin widened. He knew he had him. No, he rasped. The company was generous. The mountain is hungry. The full payment is due. Now. He looked past them, at the sun climbing higher in the sky. The shift whistle will be blowing soon. It was the talk of a madman. A man still living in the mine that had tried to bury him. You want all three, Jonas said, his voice a low growl of disbelief. That'll leave me with nothing. No leverage for next season. No guarantee you'll stay on your side of the ridge. The guarantee, Oates whispered, is that I won't come down to your quiet little house and take what's left of your memories. The guarantee is that I won't dig up your boy's bones to see if he has your eyes. The threat was a blade, twisted in an open wound. Jonas's face went white under his beard. He had built a wall around his grief, a wall made of other people's children, and now the monster he'd made a deal with was threatening to tear it down. He was beaten. He knew it. Tie them, Oates commanded, his voice a dry rustle of authority. Jonas hesitated for a heartbeat. This was it. The moment he became a full partner. The moment he stopped being a provider and became a butcher. The muscle in his jaw worked. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unslung a coil of rope from his shoulder. The girl first, Oates said, his good eye gleaming. Jonas moved toward Clara. She stood her ground, the iron poker held in a two-handed grip. You touch me, I'll take your eye out, she said, her voice low and steady. Jonas didn't answer. He moved with a sudden, brutal speed, kicking the poker out of her hands. It flew through the air and clattered against the stones. Before she could react, he had her arms pinned behind her back. She fought him, a wildcat of fury, kicking and spitting, but he was too strong. He forced her to her knees in the center of the stone circle and tied her hands behind her back with a cruel efficiency. He came for Eli next. Eli didn't fight. He knew it was useless. He let Jonas bind his wrists, the rough rope biting into his skin. He was thinking. His mind was racing, looking for an angle, a way out. The root cellar. Milo was alive. That was the only card they had left to play. But where was it? Jonas shoved him to the ground next to Clara. He looked down at them, his face a mask of grim, weary resignation. He was a man doing a job he hated, but a job he had to do. He was protecting his own ghost by feeding the monster someone else's children. As Jonas turned away, his boots scuffed against the base of the large flat stone that Oates had been standing near. It wasn't a stone. It was a slab, and it covered something. A dark, square opening into the earth. The old cellar. The stone circle wasn't a place of worship. It was a landmark. A cover for the ruins of the old homestead. Oates was looking down at them, a look of hungry satisfaction on his ruined face. The company requires an inspection, he rasped. A final accounting before the delivery is sent down the shaft. He reached into his coat and pulled something out. It wasn't a knife. It was a geologist's hammer, the kind used to split rock samples. The head was heavy, the pick end sharpened to a wicked point. It was a tool from his old life, now a weapon in his new one. He raised the hammer, the morning sun glinting on the polished steel. It was now or never. Eli strained his ears, listening, not to the madman in front of him, but to the ground beneath him. He focused, blocking out the sound of his own heart, the wind, Clara's ragged breathing. And he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound from beneath the slab. A tapping. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. Milo. He was trying to signal them. Oates took a step toward Clara, the hammer held high. Eli filled his lungs. He wasn't going to die quiet. He wasn't going to be a silent sacrifice. He threw his head back and screamed, a raw, desperate sound of pure animal defiance. "He's under the floor." The words, nonsensical and mad, ripped through the quiet morning. Oates froze, the hammer in midair, his head snapping toward Eli, his face a mask of confusion. Jonas spun around, his hand going for the knife on his belt. In that single frozen moment of surprise, Eli rolled, kicking out with both feet, and slammed his heels into the back of Jonas's knees. Chapter 24. Get him. Clara's voice was a raw, desperate shriek that cut through the chaos. Jonas went down hard, his knees buckling with a wet, crunching sound, a grunt of pure surprised pain forced from his lungs. He hit the ground like a felled tree, his rifle skittering across the dirt. Oates stood frozen for a half-second, his ruined face a mask of confusion, the geologist's hammer still held high. His mad world had a certain order to it, the provider, the delivery, the debt, and this was not part of the equation. That half-second was all they had. Eli, his hands still bound behind him, scrambled on his knees toward the flat stone slab that covered the cellar. The rough ground tore at his trousers. "The slab, Clara. We have to move it." Clara was already moving. She couldn't use her hands, so she used her head. She launched herself forward from her kneeling position and drove her forehead into Oates's midsection. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was unexpected. The madman grunted, stumbling back a step, his one good eye wide with a kind of animal surprise. The hammer wavered in his grip. Jonas roared, a sound of pure animal rage. He was on his side, trying to push himself up, his face contorted in pain. One of his legs was bent at a wrong angle. Eli's desperate kick had done real damage. "You broke my leg, you little bastard," Jonas snarled, his voice a low, guttural promise of murder. He started crawling, dragging his useless leg behind him, his hand reaching for the rifle that lay a few feet away. Eli reached the slab. It was massive, a solid piece of granite that must have taken 2 men to set in place. There was a small, recessed iron ring on one side, meant for lifting. He couldn't use it. He threw his shoulder against the edge of the stone, pushing with all his might. It didn't budge. It was like trying to move a mountain. The tapping from below grew more frantic. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Milo knew they were up there. He knew they were fighting. "It's too heavy," Eli yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. Clara had recovered, scrambling back to her feet. Oates was advancing on her again, a low, hissing sound coming from his ruined mouth. He was a predator whose prey had inexplicably fought back, and it had broken his script. He swung the hammer, a wide, clumsy arc. Clara ducked under it, the hammerhead whistling past her ear and striking one of the quartz stones with a sharp crack, sending a shower of white sparks into the air. "The poker!" Eli shouted. "Use the poker as a lever." Clara's eyes darted to where Jonas had kicked the iron poker. It lay near the edge of the stone circle. She feinted toward Oates, drawing another wild swing, then dodged away, scrambling on her hands and knees toward the poker. Jonas had reached his rifle. He grabbed it, his face slick with sweat and dirt, and tried to bring it to bear. But his broken leg made it impossible to get a steady aim from the ground. He roared in frustration, trying to prop himself up on one elbow. Eli put his back against the slab and pushed with his legs, his bound hands scraping against the rough stone. The slab moved. An inch. A sliver of blackness appeared at the edge. Clara had the poker. She couldn't grip it properly with her hands tied, but she managed to scoop it up, trapping it between her forearms. She shuffled over to the slab, her movements awkward, desperate. "The edge, Eli," she grunted. "Get it under the edge." He pushed again, every muscle screaming. The gap widened to 2 inches. Clara jammed the end of the poker into the opening. "Now," she yelled. They threw their weight against it. Eli pushed with his legs. Clara leaned on the poker. The heavy stone slab groaned, scraped against the dirt, and slid sideways, revealing a dark, gaping maw in the earth. A wave of cold, musty air rushed out, carrying the smell of rot and fear. Milo's face appeared in the opening, pale and grimy in the morning light. His eyes were wide with a terror that had been simmering for days in the dark. He wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 other faces peered out of the darkness, a boy and a girl, both younger than him, their faces hollowed out by starvation and fear. They were 2 of the children from the train. "Get out!" Eli yelled. "Get out now!" Milo scrambled out of the hole, a flash of wiry energy. He looked at the scene, Clara with the poker, Eli on the ground, Jonas trying to aim his rifle, and Oates advancing with the hammer. And his street kid mind took it all in a second. He didn't run. He grabbed the heaviest rock he could find from the edge of the grave slab and hurled it at Jonas. The rock caught Jonas in the shoulder. It wasn't enough to do real damage, but it was enough to make him cry out in pain and drop the rifle again. The other 2 children were climbing out of the cellar now, blinking in the sudden light, their limbs stiff and clumsy. They looked like ghosts. Oates let out a high, keening wail of frustration. His delivery was escaping. His neat, orderly world of debts and payments was coming apart. He ignored the others and focused on the one who had started it all. He lunged at Eli, the geologist's hammer raised high, his one good eye burning with a mad fire. Eli rolled, the hammer smashing into the dirt where his head had been a second before. He couldn't get away. His hands were still tied. He was a bug waiting to be squashed. "Hey, tin head." Milo's voice, sharp and defiant. Oates froze, turning toward the sound. Milo stood 10 feet away, next to Jonas's discarded rifle. He was holding it. It was almost as big as he was, but he had the stock braced against his hip, the long barrel wavering as he tried to aim it at Oates's chest. "You want a payment?" Milo said, his voice shaking but clear. "Here it is." Oates stared at him, then at the rifle. A strange look passed over his ruined face. Not fear. Resignation. As if this, too, was part of the script. The final shift whistle. The last collapse. He turned his back on Eli and took a slow, deliberate step toward Milo, his arms spread wide, a willing sacrifice to the mountain. "Wait." A new voice. Miriam. She was standing at the edge of the stone circle, her face a mask of wild-eyed terror. She wasn't looking at Oates. She was looking at Jonas, who was crawling, inch by painful inch, toward the skinning knife that had fallen from Clara's hand. "Jonas, no," she screamed. Her cry was the distraction they all needed. In that moment, as every eye turned toward her, Clara, freed from Oates's attention, finally worked the ropes on her wrists loose. Her hands were raw and bleeding, but they were free. She didn't go for her knife. She ran to Eli, pulling him to his feet. "The ropes," he grunted. She fumbled with the knots, her fingers clumsy with haste. Milo was still aiming the rifle at Oates, who had stopped, his head cocked, as if listening to Miriam's cry. The other 2 children were huddled together, paralyzed by fear. Jonas had his hand on the knife. The world held its breath. Clara's knife, the one she'd taken from a dead outlaw, was still in Eli's pocket. The one Jonas had given back to her was on the ground. He'd forgotten about it. "The knife," Eli said, his voice urgent. "In my pocket." Clara's hands went to his pocket, her fingers closing around the worn leather handle. The rope on his wrists fell away. Chapter 25. "Drop it, boy." Jonas's voice was a low, pain-filled rasp from the ground. He had the knife in his hand, its edge gleaming in the morning sun. His pale eyes were fixed on Milo. "That ain't a toy. You'll hurt someone." Milo didn't answer. His whole world had shrunk to the long, heavy barrel of the rifle, the small, dark figure of Oates getting closer, and the frantic hammering of his own heart. The rifle weighed a ton. His arms were shaking. Oates kept walking, his arms still spread wide, his one good eye fixed on Milo with a look of hungry, ecstatic madness. "The final payment," he whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The debt is paid. The mountain is satisfied." He was walking into the bullet, welcoming it. "Milo, don't!" Eli yelled, but his voice was lost in the tension. He saw it all in a frozen, terrible clarity. Jonas crawling, knife in hand, ready to gut whoever he could reach. Oates, the mad prophet, walking toward his own end. Miriam, a statue of grief at the edge of the circle. The two rescued children, huddled by the cellar opening like frightened rabbits. And Clara beside him, the outlaw's knife in her hand, her eyes darting between the two men, calculating an impossible angle. Milo squeezed the trigger. The world exploded in a roar of black powder and fire. The rifle, too powerful for his small frame, kicked like a mule, sending him flying backward. He landed in a heap, the heavy weapon clattering on the stones. Oates staggered. He didn't fall. A dark, wet stain blossomed on his shoulder, spreading through the tattered fabric of his coat. He looked down at the wound, not with pain, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if it were a geological sample he'd just collected. He looked back at Milo, and the lipless grin on his ruined face widened. "A good strike," he rasped. "A clean vein." That was the moment Jonas moved. He didn't go for Milo. He lunged, dragging his broken leg, not at Oates, but at Clara. He was a wounded bear, lashing out at the nearest threat, the one who had started this unraveling. Clara was ready for him. She didn't try to meet his charge. She sidestepped, quick as a cat, and brought the butt of the knife handle down hard on the back of his hand. There was a sharp crack of bone. Jonas roared in pain, the knife falling from his numb fingers. Oates ignored them all. His payment had been made. His script was complete. He turned and began to limp, slowly and deliberately, toward the open root cellar. He was going home. Back to the dark. Back to the deep places. "No," Clara said, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to walk away." She snatched up the fallen poker and ran after him. Eli was right behind her. This had to end. Here. Now. Oates reached the edge of the cellar and was about to lower himself in when Clara caught up to him. She swung the heavy iron poker like a club, aiming for his head. He turned, his movements surprisingly fast, and caught the poker on his forearm with a dull thud. The bone must have shattered, but he didn't seem to notice. His good eye burned with a cold, clear fire. He grabbed the poker with his other hand, and for a moment they were locked in a desperate struggle. Jonas was on his feet, or rather, his one good foot. He was hopping, his face a mask of sweat and agony, trying to get to his rifle. Miriam was running toward him, screaming his name, her hands outstretched. "Jonas, stop. Please. No more." Eli saw his chance. While Oates was focused on Clara, he circled around, the skinning knife held tight in his hand. He wasn't a killer. He was a boy from an orphanage. But he had seen too much death to be afraid of it anymore. He lunged, driving the knife into Oates' side just below the ribs. He felt the blade sink in, felt the sickening give of flesh and muscle. Oates grunted, a sound of surprise more than pain. He let go of the poker and swatted at Eli, a backhand blow that sent him sprawling. He looked down at the knife handle protruding from his side as if it were a minor annoyance. He pulled it out, looked at the blood on the blade, and then turned his full, mad attention on Eli. He raised the geologist's hammer. A shot rang out. It wasn't the roar of the rifle. It was the smaller, sharper crack of a pistol. Oates froze. The hammer fell from his hand. He looked down. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his chest. He looked up, his one good eye wide with a final, profound surprise. He looked at Miriam. She stood 10 feet away, behind Jonas. She was holding an old, silver-plated derringer, its small barrel still smoking. It was a lady's gun. A gambler's gun. A secret she had kept, buried as deep as her grief. Oates took one step back. His heel caught on the edge of the open cellar. He teetered there for a moment, a scarecrow on the edge of the abyss. Then he fell backward into the darkness. He didn't make a sound. He just disappeared. The silence that followed was absolute. Jonas stared at his wife, at the smoking pistol in her hand, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at the open cellar, then back at her. The fight was gone from him. The hunter was broken. "Miriam," he whispered. She didn't answer. She looked at the children, at Eli, at Clara, at Milo, who was being helped up by the 2 other terrified kids. She looked at their thin, dirty faces, their haunted eyes. And her face, for the first time, softened. The madness, the grief, receded, replaced by a vast, aching sorrow. "No more," she said, her voice clear and steady. "No more trades. No more ghosts." She turned the small pistol and pointed it at the ground, near the edge of the open cellar. She fired again. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt. She was aiming at the main support beam for the cellar roof, a thick, ancient log already half rotted through. The ground groaned. The edges of the cellar opening began to crumble. "What are you doing?" Jonas cried, dragging himself away from the collapsing earth. "Paying the last debt," Miriam said. She looked at him, and her eyes were full of a terrible final love. "He never liked the cold, Jonas." She took a step back toward the cellar. "Miriam, no." Jonas screamed, scrambling toward her, his broken leg forgotten. But she was already gone. She simply let herself fall, backward, into the collapsing grave, following the monster she had just killed. The ground gave way with a deep, guttural roar. Earth and rock and splintered wood poured into the opening, a landslide of dirt and memory. Jonas made it to the edge just as the last of the roof caved in, reaching a hand into the swirling dust, his voice a raw, broken cry of her name. When the dust settled, the cellar was gone. The stone slab was gone. All that was left was a raw, fresh scar in the earth. A new grave. For the monster. And for the woman, who had finally found her own quiet place. Jonas lay at the edge of the raw earth, his face buried in the dirt, his body shaking with sobs that had been held back for 3 long years. He was just a man, again. A broken man, alone in the wilderness with his ghosts. Eli looked at Clara, at Milo, at the 2 other children who were clinging to him. The sun was fully up now, bright and warm. The air was clean. The silence of the woods was no longer threatening. It was just quiet. He walked over to the smoldering embers of last night's fire. He picked up a burning branch, the flame a small bright flag of defiance in the morning light. He looked at the cabin, at the boneyard, at the whole sad, violent history of this place. He turned and walked toward the cabin, the torch held high. It was time to turn it into something new. The end.